Hey guys. Tonight, we begin with a time when sex wasn't just awkward, it was downright dangerous if you broke the wrong rule. It's the Middle Ages, where priests, physicians, and gossiping neighbors all had an opinion on what you should or shouldn't do in the bedroom. Spoiler, most of it was completely bizarre. The world is superstitious, restrictive, and endlessly creative when it came to mixing guilt with desire. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft, steady hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations! You've just stepped into a medieval world where even the bedroom came with a rule book. Imagine this. You open your eyes and find yourself in the middle of a stone, walled chamber. The year is somewhere around the 12th century, though no one's really checking calendars here, unless it tells them when to plant onions. The air smells of tallow candles, sorrel, and something that might be incense, or might just be someone's laundry, trying to pass for holy. You're standing in a medieval village at the most sacred, terrifying, and frankly bizarre event a person could attend, a wedding night. But this isn't the kind of wedding night where champagne is popped and tasteful Instagram stories are posted. No, this is a medieval wedding night, and according to superstition, the entire future of the marriage, fertility, prosperity, even whether the crops will grow, depends on what happens between two sweaty strangers in the dark. And worse, it depends on whether they follow the right sexual superstitions, passed down by neighbors who smell faintly of cabbage. You hear the murmurs outside, old women whispering remedies, drunk uncles shouting half-remembered prayers, and a priest frowning harder than your high school math teacher when you dared use a calculator. You might think intimacy should be private, but here, not even close. In fact, some families believed the consummation should be witnessed to make sure the union was valid. Imagine trying to get in the mood while your aunt holds a candle at the foot of the bed and mutters about God's blessings. And here's the first little gem of superstition. In many parts of medieval Europe, couples were told to place bread, salt, and sometimes a literal dead pigeon under the bed to ward off demons that might interfere with the act. Yes, demons. Because, obviously, the Prince of Darkness has nothing better to do on a Tuesday night than sabotage your honeymoon. If you're feeling unsettled right now, you should be. You haven't even seen the pigeon yet. If you're wondering what happened if the couple didn't follow these rules, well, the superstitions were clear barren wombs, cursed children, impotent husbands, maybe even cows that stopped giving milk. Honestly, medieval logic worked like a bad chain email from the early 2000s. If you don't put garlic under your mattress tonight, misfortune will follow for 7 generations. It's hard not to laugh, though. Imagine explaining this to someone today. Yes, Karen, my marriage didn't work out, but I think it's because I forgot to hide a loaf of rye under my bed the first night. Rookie mistake. The couple, wide-eyed and nervous, are now sitting on the bed, which creaks louder than the floorboards in a haunted house. Everyone's expectations are heavy in the air. The bride has been told by her grandmother to stay absolutely still. Apparently moving too much during the act could scare the seed and prevent conception. The groom, meanwhile, has been given a potion made from crushed herbs, goat's milk, and occasionally powdered testicles of a bull to increase his virility. Romantic, isn't it? Nothing says foreplay like drinking a smoothie that tastes like barnyard. Of course, none of this science works. But that didn't stop people from believing with the intensity of a sports fan whose team hasn't won since 1423. And belief, in the medieval world, was everything. The bedchamber wasn't just for two. It was a stage where the anxieties of an entire community played out. Fertility meant heirs. Heirs meant land. Land meant survival. So when the bride and groom fumbled in the dark, it wasn't just awkward, it was geopolitics. And if you think that's absurd, remember, we still have our own rituals today. Tossing a garter, smashing cake in someone's face, or posting 172 identical wedding photos online. Different century, same nervous energy. At least we don't have to worry about pigeon corpses under the duvet. Now, the candles burn lower. Someone outside coughs. A grandmother sneezes. The priest mutters a Latin phrase that sounds suspiciously like he's trying not to laugh. And you? The unfortunate time traveler stuck in this room, are realizing just how much superstition controlled the most intimate corners of medieval life. Because here's the twist for them, sex wasn't private at all. It was cosmic, spiritual, terrifying, and most of all, bound by rules that sound more like comedy sketches than religious doctrine. But don't get comfortable. If you think dead pigeons under the bed are unsettling, wait until you see what happens when medieval doctors got involved in prescribing remedies for bedroom performance. Spoiler, you'll never look at onions, frog legs, or powdered bones the same way again. The first time you hear the word aphrodisiac in this century, you'd better brace yourself, because it never means chocolate, covered strawberries, or champagne. No. Medieval aphrodisiacs were drawn from the playbook of a witch's pantry and a farmer's compost heap combined. Imagine a bearded doctor leaning over you in a smoky chamber, promising that a potion of roasted onions, dried sparrow brains, and a splash of goat bile will cure your bedroom anxieties. This is the same man who bleeds people to fix headaches. So why wouldn't you trust him with your love life? The groom, poor fellow, drinks the mixture with all the enthusiasm of a man facing his tax return. He grimaces, swallows, and waits for some sort of divine thunderbolt to strike him with passion. What he actually gets is stomach cramps and breath that could peel the plaster off the walls. But hey, in the medieval mind, suffering was usually a good sign. If it burns on the way down, it must be working. Meanwhile, the bride has her own set of instructions. According to folklore, eating eggs laid on a holy day increases fertility. So does drinking wine stirred with an iron key. And if she's really desperate, there's always the advice to place a peeled apple under her armpit all day and then feed it to her husband at night. Romantic. Debatable. Effective. Only if your kink happens to be fruity deodorant. You might laugh now, but think about modern equivalents. Energy drinks that promise performance. Fad diets that swear they'll balance your hormones. Influencers selling magic powders to fix your love life. The packaging's sheenier, sure, but deep down, we're not so different from those villagers chewing sparrow brains. The chamber is thick with smells, burnt herbs, sweat, and the faint metallic tang of iron charms hung on the bedposts. Someone has tied ribbons to the rafters, believing bright colors scare away demons. Outside, the villagers are waiting for the signal that all is well. You can almost hear them pacing, muttering prayers and, if you listen closely, placing bets. Yes, sometimes actual wagers were placed on how quickly the marriage would be consummated. People in the Middle Ages invented gambling on everything. You thought fantasy football was bad. But here's where it gets even more absurd. In certain regions, there was a superstition that if the couple failed on the first night, the blame could be shifted to witchcraft. Suddenly, some poor old woman living at the edge of the village is accused of tying the groom's knot, an invisible thread, preventing him from performing. To fix this, a ritual untying of knots, literally. The villagers would rush into the couple's chamber, yank open knots in their clothes, undo braids in the bride's hair, and even slice open tied sacks of grain in the house. All this to release his manhood from magical bondage. Imagine being mid-romantic moment when half the village bursts in to rip apart your pantry. You'd never look at a loaf of tied bread the same way again. Now, here's a little secret. The medieval world was obsessed with fertility not just because of heirs, but because infant mortality was brutally high. A couple might need to conceive half a dozen times just to have one child survive past the age of 5. That desperation bled into their rituals, their medicines, their faith. Sex wasn't just personal, it was survival. And when survival's on the line, logic often takes a back seat to pigeons, onions, and invisible knots. But don't think it was all grim. There was humor too, even in their own time. Jokes from medieval manuscripts survive where monks teased about love potions going wrong, or men blaming witches for their failures. Even back then, people rolled their eyes at how absurd some of this was. In other words, they were just like us, embarrassed, hopeful, and ready to blame someone else when things didn't work out in bed. The groom coughs again. The bride fidgets. Still clutching that apple core she's supposed to slip him later. And you, standing awkwardly in the corner of history, realize that the whole room is less about romance and more about ritual, superstition, and community anxiety wrapped in candlelight. And if you thought this was bizarre, wait until we move from wedding nights to church sermons, where priests thundered about sex with the same energy your modern HR department uses when explaining why you can't microwave fish in the office kitchen. By now, the chamber feels more like a carnival of anxieties than a honeymoon suit. The couple exchanges nervous glances. The priest clears his throat as though he's preparing to referee, and the onlookers outside shuffle their boots against the frozen ground. Somewhere a dog barks, unimpressed by the fate of human intimacy. You almost want to step forward and whisper, "Don't worry, none of this works anyway." But the truth is, they wouldn't believe you. In the medieval world, disbelief was more dangerous than demons. Take the sexual fasting superstition, for example. Couples were told that intimacy was forbidden on certain holy days: Fridays, Sundays, Advent, major feast days, minor feast days, the day before a saint's feast day, and sometimes even on Wednesdays if the priest was feeling strict. By the time you remove all the restricted dates, there were fewer legal nights of passion than there are episodes of a Netflix mini-series. Break the rule, and you weren't just sinning. You were jeopardizing the health of your unborn child, who, according to rumor, might be born deformed as punishment. Imagine explaining that to your mother-in-law. "Yes, Margaret, the baby has 2 crooked toes, because we got frisky on St. Crispin's Eve." This brings us to one of the strangest tensions of the ages. Sex was both sacred and dirty, blessed and cursed. It was a holy duty to produce children, but an unholy temptation if you enjoyed it too much. The line was thin, blurred, and constantly shifting depending on who was preaching from the pulpit that week. It's not unlike today's conflicting diet advice. One day carbs are the devil, the next they're your salvation. People in the Middle Ages just replaced gluten with lust in your corner of the room. You notice the bedposts wrapped in protective charms, strips of cloth scribbled with Bible verses, tiny wax figures meant to absorb evil spirits, even a lock of horsehair tied like a ribbon. Each object is supposed to tip the scales toward fertility. The logic goes something like this: if demons sneak into your chamber while you're busy, at least they'll be distracted chewing on the wax doll instead of cursing your childbearing abilities. This, of course, raises questions about the demon's taste in interior decor, but nobody seemed to mind. And then, the music starts, or rather, a group of villagers outside singing something halfway between a blessing and a drinking song. Because yes, there were places where consummation was accompanied by a chorus. Imagine trying to concentrate while your neighbors bellow out rhyming couplets about virility. It's like an intrusive Spotify playlist you can't turn off. Except instead of Coldplay, it's your cousin Edgar shouting about seed and soil at the top of his lungs. The bride lies still, as instructed, and the groom is doing his best to rise above both the onion potion, still burning his stomach, and the chorus outside cheering like they've bet their sheep on his performance. You almost feel bad for him, except then you remember he's supposed to be proving his manhood, not just to his wife, but to the entire community waiting beyond those stone walls. If modern couples have performance anxiety, multiply it by 100 and add the threat of a priest condemning you to eternal damnation if you don't finish quickly enough. And here's a detail that might make you squirm: sometimes the bedsheets were inspected afterward for evidence. A token of virginity, a bloodstain, a sign that the deed had been done. Families might hold up the sheet in triumph, parading it through the village like a trophy, if it wasn't there. Whispers began, reputations crumbled, and occasionally annulments were requested. Imagine your personal business becoming the medieval equivalent of a Facebook status update that everyone in town comments on, except you don't get to delete it later. By now, you probably want to scream. Why didn't they just lock the door and do what they wanted? But that's the point. Sex was never really about the couple. It was about lineage, property, religion, and superstition woven into a knot so tight it's hard to see where faith ended and fear began. That knot was exactly why they kept inventing rituals. Whether bread under the bed, herbs in a cup, or a village choir outside the window. Each charm was another attempt to control the uncontrollable, to bind chaos into order with pigeons, onions, and holy mutterings. And here's the kicker sometimes, when things went wrong, when the bride didn't conceive, or when the marriage soared, the superstitions only multiplied. More potions, more rituals, more accusations of witchcraft. It was never the system at fault. It was always the couple who failed to follow the ritual exactly, or the shadowy hand of sorcery pulling strings. Much like today, when your Wi-Fi cuts out, and you try everything except admitting that your router is just broken. The chamber grows hotter with candle smoke. The bride shifts nervously. The groom adjusts his tunic. Outside, the singing fades to murmurs, then to silence. For a moment, you almost feel the weight of history pressing against the stone walls. The collective anxiety of generations who believed the fate of their families, their fields, even their souls, hinged on what two young people did in the dark. You want to laugh at the absurdity, but you also want to cry. Because beneath the pigeon feathers and apple charms, there's a very human fear, the fear of not being enough, of failing your role, of letting everyone down. And just when you think you've seen enough oddities for one night, someone knocks at the door. It's a midwife, holding a clay pot, and insisting the couple rub their bodies with warmed honey before lying together. She swears it improves fertility and wards off jealous spirits. The groom hesitates. The bride glares. You, the accidental time traveler, bite your lip to keep from shouting, "For heaven's sake, just let them be!" But the midwife is firm. Honey first, then destiny. As the ritual continues, your mind drifts ahead. Because if these are the superstitions tied to the wedding bed, what happens when the church steps in more forcefully? What happens when priests preach about the sin of desire, when rules tighten, when whispers of witches and incubi spread? You thought dead pigeons were bad. Wait until you see what people believed lurked in the shadows of the bedroom itself. The morning bell tolls, low and solemn, dragging the entire village toward the church like a magnet drags iron filings. You're swept along with the crowd, your boots crunching on frost, your nose filled with the smoky tang of burning peat. People shuffle, whispering, pulling their cloaks tighter, some still bleary from last night's festivities. And as you enter the heavy wooden doors, the smell shifts instantly, from manure and mead outside to incense and candle wax inside, a cocktail of sanctity and suffocation. The church is cold, stone ribs arching overhead, but the preacher's words are hot with warning. He stands in the pulpit, voice booming, finger wagging, eyes scanning the crowd as if every one of them has already sinned. And in a way they have. Because in his mind, simply being alive means you've already thought about sex. And simply thinking about sex means you're halfway to hell. You wedge yourself between a farmer's wife with red hands and a boy trying to look holy while chewing on a crust of bread. The preacher leans forward dramatically. Fornicators, he thunders, invite demons into their beds. Gasps ripple through the pews. The boy next to you swallows his bread too fast and coughs. The farmer's wife mutters an amen, though she looks like she'd rather be anywhere else. The superstition here isn't subtle. People truly believed that lust opened the door to spiritual invasion. In medieval theology, it wasn't just your soul at stake. It was your body. Men whispered about succubi, demonic women who would climb onto them in the night, draining their life force. Women feared incubi, male demons who forced themselves upon them in their sleep. And if you're wondering how anyone proved these encounters, well, every unwanted pregnancy, every unexplained desire, every embarrassing failure could be blamed on demons. Convenient, isn't it? The preacher knows this. He plays the crowd like a lute, strumming their fears until they're taut as bowstrings. Guard your beds, he shouts. Guard your thoughts. A baby starts crying in the back pew, the sound echoing off stone walls like an accidental amen. He raises his hand, palm out, as if to physically block temptation itself. And you can't help but smirk, because really, what's the medieval equivalent of clear your browser history? Apparently, sprinkling holy water on your sheets. And oh, they did. People doused their bed linens with blessed water, tucked relics under pillows, and muttered prayers before climbing under itchy wool blankets. One superstition even instructed couples to draw a chalk circle around their bed, a kind of holy, do not enter. Sign for demons. If your modern roommate saw you chalking protective circles around your futon, they'd probably move out. Back then, it was just Tuesday night. The farmer's wife sighs beside you, clearly used to this routine. You lean in, catching a whiff of onions and smoke. And she mutters without looking at you. Last week he said eating too much cheese makes you lustful. My husband hasn't touched butter since. She rolls her eyes heavenward, and you have to bite your tongue not to laugh. The preacher continues, blissfully unaware that his sermons are creating lactose-free diets centuries before TikTok. But laughter aside, the fear is real. Every act of intimacy is shadowed by rules: no passion on holy days, no strange positions lest you risk producing deformed children, no sex in daylight because apparently God has better things to do than watch, but might glance out his window at noon. People carried this anxiety like a second skin, flinching every time desire stirred, wondering if it was God's gift or the devil's trap. And of course, there were remedies, always remedies. Priests and self-proclaimed healers handed out prayers like prescriptions, amulets like condoms. A verse of the Psalms could be recited before bed to ward off incubus visits. An iron key under the mattress protected women from unwanted entry. And one text even recommended rubbing the sign of the cross on the belly after intimacy, just in case the devil had slipped something in. Imagine explaining that to your partner today. Hold on, I just need to do some quick holy graffiti on your stomach before we sleep. The service drags on. Your legs cramp. A chicken clucks in someone's basket at the back. Ignored. But the preacher is relentless. He shifts now to warning against lustful thoughts in church itself, which feels a little like warning against hunger in a bakery. Do not let your minds wander, he bellows. Half the congregation immediately looks guilty, which only proves his point. The boy beside you picks at the wood of the pew, trying not to smirk. And you catch yourself wondering whether the preacher has ever followed his own advice. Here's the thing: much of what he says is contradictory. Some sermons insisted that marital intimacy was holy, others painted it as sinful unless purely for procreation. One text went so far as to say that even married couples risked eternal damnation if they enjoyed it too much. That's right, fun itself was suspect. Imagine trying to keep a straight face in a confessional booth while admitting, "Forgive me, Father, I might have smiled during." Yet, despite the absurdity, the fear worked. Fear kept people in line, fear filled pews, fear drove donations. And superstition clung to that fear like ivy on stone. You couldn't separate one from the other. To them, demons weren't abstract ideas. They were as real as fleas or frostbite. If your husband faltered on your wedding night, demon. If your wife avoided you, demon. If your cow gave sour milk, probably demons upset by your lust. As the sermon nears its climax, the preacher slams his hand on the pulpit so hard the wood rattles. "You must confess! You must cleanse!" His voice echoes like thunder in the cold nave. The crowd shifts, uneasy. Some nod solemnly. Some avoid his eyes. One man yawns, earning a smack from his wife. You realize that beneath the fear, there's fatigue. People are tired of being told every impulse is dangerous, every touch is suspect. They still obey, but obedience has the wariness of habit. The bell tolls again. The crowd shuffles out, blinking into daylight. The farmer's wife mutters about missing her butter. The boy darts off to chase a dog. The preacher remains, shadowed in the doorway, his robes catching the winter light. And you, stepping back into the chill air, feel both the weight of superstition pressing down and the absurdity of it all tugging at the corners of your mouth. Because no matter how serious the sermon, people will still sneak glances, still laugh behind hands, still find ways to live around the rules. But if you thought sermons were heavy-handed, just wait until you see the punishments. Because for those who disobeyed, whether caught in the act, accused by neighbors, or simply unlucky enough to be gossiped about, the consequences were public, humiliating, and sometimes downright grotesque. And nothing reveals the dark comedy of medieval superstition more than what happened when your private sins were dragged out into the village square. The village square smells like mud, sweat, and boiled cabbage, a perfume no amount of incense could ever disguise. You're drawn there by a knot of people clustered around a wooden post, their chatter buzzing like flies over meat. At the center stands a man red-faced and nervous, with a sign hung around his neck. The sign reads, crudely scrawled, lustful. He's not being executed. No, today's punishment is public shaming, medieval style. And if you think a passive, aggressive tweet is brutal, you haven't seen what happens when a whole community turns your personal life into theater. The crier clears his throat and announces the man's crime. "Caught with his neighbor's wife!" Gasps ripple through the crowd. Some pretend to be scandalized, others lean in with hungry curiosity, and a few smirk, probably thinking, well, at least it wasn't me this time. The accused stares at the ground, trying to disappear into his own boots. The punishment begins. He's ordered to parade through the streets wearing nothing but a thin shift, holding a candle taller than his dignity. Children laugh, old women cluck, and men jeer. It's not just humiliation, it's ritual. Public shaming was believed to cleanse the community of the sin, almost like a human sacrifice of pride instead of flesh. If one man's humiliation kept demons away from the harvest, well then so be it. You trail along as the parade moves through crooked streets. People throw stale bread at him. A dog follows, barking like it's in on the joke. And you can't help but notice the hypocrisy. Some of the loudest jeerers probably committed the same crime themselves, just better at hiding it. It's the same energy as people in modern comment sections, condemning others while quietly guilty of the same indulgences. Sometimes, though, punishments weren't so tame. For women accused of lust, superstitions could get cruel fast. One poor woman might be forced to wear a bridle, like contraption called a scold's bridle, a metal cage clamped over her head, with a bit shoved in her mouth. The logic: silence her tongue, and you silence her temptations. Of course, it mostly just silenced her dignity. Villagers would laugh, toss insults, maybe even poke with sticks as she stumbled past. A grotesque carnival in the name of morality. And then there were the stocks. The medieval equivalent of a viral scandal. Once locked in, you became a living statue of shame. People would pelt you with mud, rotten eggs, or whatever was handy. If your crime was sexual, the insults doubled, and your punishment turned into entertainment. It was superstition weaponized. If the community saw you suffer, maybe their own sins wouldn't call demons into town. You became both scapegoat and soap opera. But it wasn't only individuals punished. Sometimes whole couples were targeted. In France, there's record of a superstition where if a man failed to perform, the newlyweds could be summoned to court. Imagine standing before a judge, your bedroom failures dissected like evidence in a trial. In one famous case, a groom was ordered to prove his virility in public, with court-appointed witnesses. Unsurprisingly, the man failed under pressure, and his marriage was annulled. Public humiliation and a ruined future, all because superstition declared fertility a civic matter. You pause, leaning against a crooked wooden beam, as the accused man in the square finally completes his candlelit walk of shame. The crowd disperses, muttering about his disgrace. A boy imitates him, waddling with exaggerated shame, while his friends laugh. You sigh. The ritual's over, but the memory will linger, as it was designed to. Punishment was theater, and theater was memory. No one would forget. Still, the absurdity peeks through. You catch a group of young women giggling in the corner, whispering about how lustful he must have been to get caught. Their faces flush, their laughter bubbling into forbidden territory. It's the classic paradox: condemn something loudly enough, and people just become more curious about it. The medieval church never figured out that the best way to get people obsessed with sex is to keep screaming about how dangerous it is. Walking away from the square, you pass a small house where a woman whispers to her neighbor over a low fence. You lean in, eavesdropping shamelessly. They say her husband was bewitched. The woman murmurs, "That's why he can't perform. Someone tied his knot." The neighbor gasps, hand flying to her mouth. Bewitched, cursed, demon touched. It's always easier to blame invisible forces than admit life is messy. And you realize that superstition wasn't just imposed from the pulpit. It thrived in whispers, in gossip, in kitchens and marketplaces where ordinary people created their own logic to explain the unexplainable. The irony is rich. For all their fear of lust, people kept inventing new ways to talk about it, new rituals to control it, new punishments to dramatize it. Lust was the medieval world's favorite villain, always lurking, always blamed, always punished, but never truly defeated. If anything, The punishments only gave it more power, more presence, more spectacle. As night falls, the square empties, the church doors close, and silence seeps into the streets. But in that silence, you can almost hear the echoes of laughter, the sting of insults, the quiet sobs of the shamed. You think about the farmer's wife who just wanted butter, about the bride clutching her apple core, about the man forced to hold a candle while neighbors sneered, each one trapped in a web of superstition they didn't choose, but couldn't escape. And just as you're about to retreat to your imaginary inn for the night, a figure brushes past you, hooded, quick-footed, muttering under his breath. You catch a single word, remedy. Curiosity prickles your skin. Because if the sermons and punishments controlled public life, then the remedies, the secret potions, charms, and midnight rituals, ruled private life. And if you thought pigeons and onions were strange, just wait until you see what medieval lovers hid under their mattresses in the desperate hope of controlling passion and fate. The village is quieter now, though not silent. As you walk down the crooked lane, torches gutter in the cool night air, sending sparks into the dark. The sermons and shaming rituals of the day may have ended, but behind shuttered windows and bolted doors, another world is stirring. Because where the pulpit thundered about punishment, the hearth whispered about remedies. You slip close to a cottage. Its window cracked open just enough to let the scent of herbs drift out. Inside, a woman stirs something in a clay pot, her face lit orange by firelight. She's muttering under her breath, words half prayer, half incantation. At first, you think she's just making soup, but then she sprinkles something into the mixture, a curl of hair, maybe, or the edge of a fingernail, and the tone shifts. This isn't dinner. This is insurance against lust. Medieval remedies for sexual troubles came in flavors that ranged from quaint to outright alarming. Some were about boosting fertility, others about killing desire, and others about ensuring faithfulness. But the logic was always the same: if lust was a wild, dangerous force, then better to tie it down with potions and charms before it wreaked havoc. You move on, ducking beneath a sagging timber beam, and find another house where a young bride crouches near her bed. She slipped something beneath the straw mattress, a sprig of rosemary bound with red thread. It's meant to keep her husband faithful, warding off the wandering eye and the dreaded curse of impotence. The irony. Rosemary also masked smells, which, considering medieval hygiene, might have been the real reason husbands stayed home. The remedies weren't always herbal, though. Sometimes, they ventured into the truly grotesque. Take, for example, the popular belief that drinking a potion made with powdered animal genitals could restore virility. A little ram's testicle in your wine, and suddenly you're promised the stamina of a beast. Never mind that it probably just tasted awful and gave you food poisoning. Belief was stronger than evidence. And if your stomach cramped up, well, maybe that was just the potion working. Then there were talismans. Rings carved with symbols, amulets strung with teeth or stones. Charms inscribed with Latin phrases so badly spelled that even the saints probably rolled their eyes. Some were worn against infertility, others against adultery. But one favorite was the so-called chastity charm, slipped secretly into a spouse's clothing. The theory was simple: the object absorbed desire like a sponge, keeping the wearer safe. The practice was less simple if discovered. It could just as easily earn you accusations of witchcraft. You duck into a smoky tavern, where remedies weren't whispered but bragged about. Two men sit sloshed on ale, voices loud enough for everyone to hear. One boasts about a potion his wife gave him, a brew of boiled eggs, goat's milk, and a pinch of ashes from the church altar. "Worked wonders," he declares, thumping his chest. His friend laughs and replies with his own tale. "Try pigeon hearts. 3 of them, eaten raw, and she won't stray." You wince. It's the medieval version of locker, room advice, except with much higher odds of salmonella. The tavern's air is thick with smoke and sour drink, and you feel yourself coughing. The remedies here blur the line between medicine and magic, fact and folklore. In a world where doctors were scarce, priests disapproved, and superstition ruled, every kitchen and tavern became its own laboratory. It's almost touching, the creativity people poured into solving problems that science wouldn't touch for centuries. Almost touching, until you remember the pigeon hearts. but perhaps the most fascinating were the love potions. Not just remedies against lust, but concoctions designed to summon it. A maiden desperate to catch a suitor might grind up herbs, fennel maybe, or thyme, and slip them into his drink. A wife fearing neglect might add powdered beetles to her husband's stew. Some potions included stranger ingredients, menstrual blood, bone scrapings, or even a bit of earth from a grave. And if you're wondering whether these potions worked, the answer is, well, maybe not chemically, but psychologically. Absolutely. If you believed love was in your cup, you might just convince yourself it was. Placebo and passion have always been cozy bedfellows. There's even record of a woman accused of feeding her lover bread baked with her own bodily fluids to keep him faithful. Disgusting. Certainly. Effective. Hard to say. But it tells you something about the desperation when superstition ruled. People were willing to blur every line. Between medicine and magic. Between affection and coercion. Between dinner and ritual. You step back out into the night, the tavern noise fading, and wander toward the edge of the village. There, you spot a small group gathered under a tree. They speak in hushed tones, passing around a cloth bundle. You edge closer. Inside the bundle lies a bird, its feathers plucked in odd patterns, its body bound with thread. One man whispers a chant, while another spits into the dirt. This isn't a remedy, it's a binding ritual. The bird represents a rival, its impotence or submission ensured through sympathetic magic. The group believes that by tying the bird, they tie the desires of their enemy, keeping him weak in bed and powerless in life. And here's the unsettling part. They believe it completely. No shadow of doubt. In their world, lust is not just a private urge, but a battlefield where neighbors sabotage each other. Wives try to secure loyalty, and husbands try to prove dominance. Remedies aren't silly curios, they're weapons. The night deepens, stars scattered across the sky like spilled flour. As you drift back toward the inn, the smells of rosemary, goat milk, and pigeon hearts cling to you. You realize you've walked through a hidden world, one rarely written in chronicles or sung by bards. It lived in kitchens, bedrooms, and taverns, in whispered instructions, in recipes smudged into parchment, in amulets tucked beneath straw beds. You climb the creaking stairs of the inn, the boards groaning under your weight, and pause by your door. Somewhere outside, a dog howls. Somewhere closer, a couple argues, their voices low and tense. Remedies, you realize, were more than superstition. They were an attempt at control in a world where little was controllable. They were a way to take fate into your own hands. However clumsily, however bizarrely. But as you close your eyes, the images flicker: pigeons, rosemary, goat's milk, hair in a cauldron. And you can't help but think, if these were the remedies, then what of the curers? What of the professional healers? The midwives and cunning folk who made entire livelihoods from lust's anxieties. If you thought pigeon hearts were disturbing, wait until you step into their world, where superstition and business became indistinguishable, and where the line between healer and heretic could vanish overnight. Morning creeps back into the village, pale and reluctant, dragging with it the smell of smoke from last night's hearths. A cock crows somewhere in the distance, though it sounds more tired than triumphant. You step out of the inn and find the village beginning to stir, women drawing water from the well, children scattering barefoot across the mud, men squinting at the sky to guess the weather. But not everyone is about ordinary business. At the far end of the square, a figure in a patched cloak has set up a small wooden table. Bottles of cloudy liquid gleam in the sun, some tinged green, others red. Next to them, small bags of powder sit tied with twine, and a worn leather book lies open, its pages scrawled with symbols. The figure is one of the cunning folk, a healer, a spell maker, part respected and part feared. If you asked villagers, they'd give you different answers. One would swear the cunning man saved his wife from barrenness. Another would whisper that his neighbor's impotence was his doing, inflicted through a curse. Another would insist the priest disapproves, but still sneaks by at night to buy remedies. The truth is, all of them are right. The cunning folk were both medicine and menace, salvation and suspicion, depending on who you asked, and how well their remedies worked. You draw closer, listening to the pitch. The man's voice rises and falls like a trained bard. "A draught to cool the fires of lust," he announces, holding up a flask of cloudy water. Safe for maidens, safe for wives, safe for husbands too easily tempted. A woman settles up, coins clinking nervously in her pouch. She buys one, wrapping it quickly in cloth. Does she mean it for herself or her husband? Nobody asks. Nobody ever asks. Next he lifts a packet of powder. Ground stag's horn! Restores strength where weakness lies! Two men shuffle closer, nodding, trading glances. They don't buy in public. They'll wait until night, when shadows offer privacy. But they're listening, memorizing the price. This is the strange marketplace of desire: potions against lust, powders for lust, charms to secure fidelity, curses to spoil rivals. The cunning folk thrived because sex was both terrifying and unignorable. People would risk damnation, scandal, even accusations of witchcraft, if it meant fixing what they saw as a fault in the body, or in someone else's. And then, of course, there were the midwives. Their world was different, less public, more intimate. Step into a cottage where a midwife practices, and you find a room cluttered with herbs hanging from rafters, jars of oils lining the walls, and cloth stained with old use. Midwives were practical. They delivered babies, soothed mothers, and tried to prevent death when death was always near. But they also carried knowledge of fertility and contraception that men, especially priests, found both threatening and irresistible. A whispered recipe for a fertility charm: dried juniper, berries mixed into honey, taken with wine. A whispered recipe for contraception: pennyroyal leaves brewed into tea. Another for ending an unwanted pregnancy: tansy, though the risks were deadly. Midwives walked a razor's edge, balancing necessity with danger. Their remedies weren't just cures. They were acts of survival, often for women with no other options. You picture a young girl, no more than 16, clutching her belly in fear. She whispers to the midwife in a corner, away from her mother's ears. The midwife nods, presses a pouch of herbs into her hand, and mutters instructions. The girl's face brightens with relief, but you can't help but wonder, will it save her, or kill her? In a world where medicine was guesswork, every dose was a gamble. The church, of course, hated this knowledge. Anything that interfered with God's plan was branded suspicious. A love charm might be tolerated as foolishness. A fertility potion could be brushed aside as quaint. But contraception, abortion, these were dangerous, not only to the woman but to the authority of the pulpit. So midwives were watched carefully. Too much knowledge, too much success, and suddenly a midwife became a witch in the eyes of her neighbors. You step outside again, the sunlight too bright, and find yourself at the edge of a small traveling fair. A new sort of merchant has arrived, one more flamboyant than the humble cunning folk. He stands on a raised barrel, hat tipped at an angle, calling out promises that grow wilder with every word. Behold the elixir of Venus herself! A sip, and you will know passion! A cup, and you will sire sons like Alexander the Great! The crowd laughs, half mocking, half curious. He flourishes a bottle. Its contents a suspiciously ordinary shade of brown. You can smell it even from here, probably wine, maybe laced with spices. But he sells 3 bottles before you can blink, each one exchanged for more coin than a peasant might earn in a week. This is another layer of the remedy world. Outright charlatans, traveling from village to village, selling snake oil to the desperate. The villagers know on some level that they're being swindled, but hope is stronger than suspicion. And in the silence of night, when a husband fails his wife, or a wife feels her husband stray, a bottle on the shelf is easier than shame, easier than prayer. You drift through the fair, ears catching fragments of conversation. Drink from a bull's horn, and it'll cure barrenness. Rub ashes on your thighs to cool desire. Tee a rooster's feather in your belt, and your husband won't look at other women. The remedies sound absurd, but the conviction is real. And that conviction, maybe more than any herb or potion, is what gave them power. It wasn't just peasants either. Nobles had their own bizarre cures, often cloaked in more expensive ingredients, but no less strange. In a manor house, a physician might prescribe crushed emeralds for impotence, or powdered gold for infertility. A wealthy lady might pay dearly for a necklace of precious stones, blessed by a priest, believed to guard her chastity. One king, so the rumor goes, kept a vial of dried wolf penis as a safeguard against weakness. Nobility dressed their superstition in jewels and Latin, but it was superstition all the same. You pause near the edge of the fair, watching a pair of friars argue with a cunning woman. "Your remedies are sin," one shouts, his tonsure gleaming in the sun. She snaps back, "And what of your holy water, Father? Does it not claim the same?" The crowd chuckles nervously. Everyone knows the priest condemns charms while secretly using them. The hypocrisy is obvious, but no one dares say it aloud. The friar huffs and storms away, but the woman stays, continuing to sell her bundles of herbs. You notice her hands, stained green from leaves, her eyes darting nervously from face to face. She knows she's walking a dangerous path. A single accusation, a single misfortune in the village, and those friars will come knocking. Not with questions, but with torches. As the sun dips low, shadows stretch across the square, and the fair begins to pack up. The cunning man folds his bottles away. The charlatan vanishes down the road with a jingling purse. The midwife returns to her cottage, where another anxious girl will knock before morning. And you realize that all of them, honest healers, greedy frauds, desperate women, are part of the same story. The story of how people tried to tame lust in a world where lust was untamable. For the remedies themselves rarely worked, not in the way people hoped. But they worked in another sense. They gave people the illusion of control, the comfort of action, the hope of change. In a world ruled by chance, crop failures, plagues, childbirth, desire itself, hope was worth more than gold. You leave the square and wander into the fields beyond. Crickets sing in the tall grass, and the last light fades behind the hills. The remedies echo in your mind: stag's horn, rosemary, pigeon hearts, powdered emeralds. Some grotesque, some quaint, some heartbreaking. All of them stitched together by the same thread: fear of the body, fear of desire, and the desperate urge to master both. And as the stars begin to blink awake above you, you sense that you've reached a turning point. Remedies are one thing, private, desperate, intimate. But what of punishment? What of the public spectacle, the shame, the violent tools used not to cure lust, but to crush it? That world waits just beyond the horizon. And if you thought pigeon hearts and powdered emeralds were strange, the punishments will make them seem almost merciful. The first sound is not a voice, nor a bell, but the slow, deliberate creak of wood. It comes from the marketplace square, where a new structure has been raised overnight. Stout beams, a platform, and most striking of all, an upright frame with 2 holes cut through the middle. The pillory. Villagers gather, drawn as much by morbid curiosity as by obligation. Children dart forward, whispering, pointing. The baker leans on his shovel. The miller wipes flour from his arms. The parish priest folds his hands tightly behind his back. All of them know what's coming. All of them are complicit. A woman is led forward, her wrists bound. Her face is pale, her hair tangled from a night in the damp cell. She has been accused of adultery. Not proven, not even tried in any meaningful sense. Merely accused. That is enough. The crowd doesn't want proof, it wants spectacle. With a grunt, the constable shoves her head into the wooden slot. The pillory closes, locking her neck and wrists. Now she is immobilized, vulnerable, on display. The punishment isn't simply confinement, it is humiliation. For hours, perhaps days, she will stand in public, subjected to the jeers, the spit, the rotting vegetables hurled from every direction. And yet, look closer. In her eyes there is not only fear but also defiance. She knows this punishment is not about her sin. It is about the villagers' fear of desire, about making an example so others will not follow. She is a scapegoat for lust itself. As the crowd begins to mutter, you notice patterns. Some villagers throw their insults eagerly, others hang back, uneasy, ashamed of their participation but unwilling to resist. A few slip away entirely, not wanting to be seen. And the priest, he preaches loudly, citing scripture, reminding all that fornicators and adulterers God will judge. His voice is stern, but his eyes wander. You wonder what he sees, and what he hides. The pillory was not unique. Across medieval and early modern Europe, communities devised countless ways to publicly punish lust. Stocks, where legs were locked and victims sat helpless as children mocked them. The cocking stool, a wooden chair used to dunk women, often accused of sexual looseness or nagging, into rivers until they were half drowned. The scold's bridle, an iron cage that fit over the head, with a spiked bit pressed against the tongue, silencing the accused woman under threat of bleeding with every word. Each punishment carried a message: your body is not yours. Your desire is not yours. Step outside the approved bounds, and we will strip you of dignity in front of everyone you know. The punishment was never private. It was meant to be witnessed, to linger in memory, to ripple through gossip for years. Step into a German town square in the 1500s, and you might witness another form, the shame parade. A man accused of adultery might be forced to ride backward on a donkey, holding its tail, while villagers hurled insults. A woman might be shaved bald, her hair, the symbol of her beauty, sacrificed to the sneers of her neighbors. Sometimes adulterous couples were tied together and marched through town, a grotesque parody of a wedding procession. And in the worst cases, punishment escalated to mutilation. In certain Italian cities, men caught in adultery had their noses cut off, an indelible mark impossible to hide. In France, a woman might have her clothes ripped from her body in public before being flogged, her nakedness part of the punishment. It is hard to know which wound cut deeper, the pain of the flesh or the eternal scar of shame. You move with the crowd as the woman in the pillory begins to weep. Some laugh, others avert their eyes. You can almost feel the tension, the mix of cruelty and pity, righteousness and unease. For deep down, every person in the square knows desire runs through their own veins too. The punishment is meant to scare them into obedience, but it also reminds them of their own hidden impulses. That is why the punishments are so loud, so theatrical. The noise is meant to drown out the silence of confession. Travel across the Channel to England, and you find an even more ritualized spectacle, the church penance. Here the sinner, guilty of fornication or adultery, is forced to stand barefoot at the church door, wearing a white shift, holding a candle, reciting prayers as the congregation files past. The act is public, humiliating, and yet wrapped in a strange veneer of forgiveness. The sinner begs for mercy not only from God but from neighbors. And if forgiveness is granted, it is grudging, conditional, never fully sincere. But what of harsher lands, where law was less forgiving? In Puritan New England, adultery was not merely punished with shame, it could be punished with death. We think of Nathaniel Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter as fiction, but branding and permanent marks were very real. A convicted adulteress might have an A cut into her flesh or burned into her skin with a hot iron. Men, too, were whipped through the streets until their backs split open, their blood a warning to all. The Puritans were not unique. In parts of the Islamic world under strict interpretations of law, stoning was a prescribed punishment for adultery. A sentence so brutal, it could only be carried out with the complicity of the entire community. The very stones that built the village were turned against the body of the sinner. The crowd became executioner, each hand complicit, each hand stained. Even within Europe, punishments varied wildly by region. In Catholic Spain, the Inquisition occasionally dealt with sexual sins, though its true obsession was heresy. In Italy, courts might mete out fines for prostitution, but reserve death for repeat offenders. In Scandinavia, shame punishments were common, forcing couples caught in sin to run gauntlets of mockery. Every culture had its instruments, but all played the same tune: lust must be controlled, punished, exposed. You pause on the edge of another square, this one in a bustling French town. A scaffold stands tall, but instead of pillories or stools, a stage is set. Actors in masks prance about, mocking a well-known adulterer. It is not punishment in the legal sense, but punishment all the same: satire, ridicule, laughter as weapon. For what is worse than being laughed at by everyone you know? The punishment here is cultural, not corporal, yet its sting lasts just as long. Of course, not all punishments were equal. Class shaped everything. A nobleman caught in adultery might face a fine, a polite exile, or the quiet rebuke of a bishop. A peasant woman might face the stool, the lash, or worse. The law was supposedly universal, but power bent it. Wealth bought silence. Poverty guaranteed spectacle. And what of the children, watching from the edge of the crowd? They saw their neighbors humiliated, beaten, paraded. They absorbed the message early. Lust is dangerous, lust is shameful, lust is punished, yet curiosity lingers. When those same children grew into adults, they repeated the cycle, both desiring and condemning, both hiding and exposing. The air grows colder as night falls, but punishment does not rest. A man is dragged through the mud, accused of soliciting prostitutes. His punishment is simple but cruel: the bridle run. He is tied to a rope and led from tavern to tavern,
mocked with jeers of husband of whores.
The laughter cuts sharper than any blade. He stumbles, his face coated with muck, and the crowd roars. This is entertainment. This is justice. This is fear weaponized. And yet, even as you witness these punishments, a question gnaws at you. Did they work? Did humiliation truly quell lust? Or did it simply drive it deeper underground? Records suggest both. Some people were broken, cowed, forced into silence. Others returned defiantly to their lovers, their desires unshaken. For every scarlet letter meant to prevent adultery, there was another secret rendezvous, another forbidden night. Perhaps, then, the punishments were less about stopping lust, and more about displaying control. They reminded the community who held power, the priests, the magistrates, the men who dictated morality. They turned the private act of desire into a public performance of authority. As you lie awake in the straw of the inn that night, the sounds of punishment echo in your ears: the crack of a whip, the splash of water, the laughter of a crowd. The remedies of herbs and potions seem almost merciful now, in comparison. For here, lust is not only feared, it is weaponized, turned into a stage for cruelty. And yet, tomorrow will bring more. Tomorrow, perhaps, you will see not just humiliation but mutilation. Tomorrow, perhaps, you will witness death, for the story of punishment is far from over. The night is restless. Somewhere outside your chamber window, a dog barks, and you imagine the uneasy shuffle of footsteps in the mud. Dawn comes grey and heavy, the sky swollen with clouds, as if the heavens themselves anticipate judgment. You follow the villagers once more to the square, where the scaffold has been rebuilt, higher this time and more grim. Today will not be pillories or laughter. Today will be blood. A man is dragged forward by guards, his wrists bound, his shirt torn open to expose flesh. His crime, adultery with another man's wife. But this time, the punishment is not humiliation or parade. The magistrate has decreed that the man will be whipped to the edge of death, then branded. The executioner approaches, whip coiled like a serpent, iron brand heating in the coals. The first strike lands, splitting skin, and the crowd gasps. A child cries out, quickly hushed by his mother. The second strike draws blood. By the fifth, flesh is dangling in strips. The condemned man bites his tongue to keep from screaming, but when the brand is pressed against his chest, searing and into his skin, he collapses in agony. His punishment is eternal. The scar will follow him until death, marking him for every eye that looks upon him. This is not justice. This is theatre. The spectacle is meant to sear itself into memory, a lesson that desire can destroy not only the soul but the body. You have seen whips, brands, pillories. But punishment goes further still. In some corners of Europe, lust is punishable by fire itself. The execution for adultery, especially for women, could be burning at the stake. The symbolism is unmistakable: lust, a fire of the flesh, consumed by fire of the law. A body turned to ash, desire erased in smoke. Step into 16th century Geneva, ruled by Calvin's stern hand, and you will find executions for adultery recorded with chilling efficiency. In 1546 alone, the registers show men beheaded, women drowned, couples burned. For Calvinist morality, lust was not simply weakness. It was rebellion against God. To crush rebellion, they believed, required absolute terror. Cross into Catholic Spain, and the Inquisition becomes your shadow. Though its primary focus was heresy, lust often became entangled with blasphemy. A priest caught in relations with a parishioner could be defrocked, flogged, exiled, or worse. The Inquisition wielded fire with holy justification, and countless bodies fed its flames. Adulterers, sodomites, prostitutes, anyone whose desires strayed outside the permitted path risked being consumed, their screams drowned by the chants of prayer. Yet fire was not the only element harnessed against lust. In certain German towns, adulterers were drowned in rivers. Husbands and wives caught together in infidelity might be tied, back to back, and cast into the water. If they floated, it was God's judgment. If they sank, it was God's judgment too. No escape, no mercy. The water swallowed desire whole, and still there were cruelties of steel. In Italy and the Low Countries, castration was sometimes used as punishment for male lust. It was not just mutilation, it was erasure, the removal of manhood, a permanent, grotesque reminder of transgression. Some records suggest that castration was performed publicly. The crowd forced to watch the executioner's knife reduce a man to a bleeding shadow of himself. a punishment so severe it silenced even laughter. Women were not spared mutilation. In France, certain customs dictated that adulteresses might have their noses cut off, leaving a disfigured face as permanent evidence of sin. It was not enough to punish. The punishment had to endure, a mark carried in every glance, every whisper, every silence. And yet there were cruelties even stranger. In parts of Central Europe, couples caught in fornication were forced to wear shame masks, grotesque iron helmets shaped like beasts, pigs, or demons. They shuffled through town, mocked as symbols of animal lust. The masks were heavy, cutting into the scalp, leaving sores. They were meant to turn the human into the monstrous, the lover into the beast. Sometimes punishments crossed into the theatrical grotesque. In Bologna, a man convicted of adultery might be paraded in a cart, dressed in women's clothing, mocked as effeminate, stripped of dignity. In rural villages, cuckolds were forced to wear horns strapped to their heads, paraded while neighbors sang obscene songs. Humiliation became ritual, cruelty became carnival. But death, the final punishment, always hovered near. In England under Henry V, adultery could be treason if it involved the king's wife. Anne Boleyn, Queen herself, stood accused not only of adultery but of incest, of witchcraft, of unnatural lusts. Her execution by sword in 1536 was not only a political act but a moral performance. Her fall reminded all that lust, or even the suspicion of lust, could bring down queens as easily as peasants. Nor was this unique to England. In Persia, stoning for adultery was inscribed into law. Stones were chosen deliberately, not too large to kill instantly, not too small to merely sting, but just heavy enough to wound, to break, to crush slowly. The punishment was not only death but prolonged agony, carried out by the very hands of the community. To hurl a stone was to declare loyalty to God and law, to prove oneself untainted by the same sin. But as you wander through centuries of records, a truth emerges. These punishments, no matter how brutal, did not end lust. They merely changed its shape. Lovers met more carefully, more secretly. Brothels flourished in the shadows, often protected by the very magistrates who punished others in public. Priests thundered against adultery from pulpits, even as they whispered to lovers in the dark. Kings and popes kept mistresses while their subjects burned. The hypocrisy is staggering. Those in power punished lust mercilessly among the weak, while indulging freely themselves. Desire was condemned for the poor, but excused for the noble. Criminal for women, but tolerated in men. Justice was never blind. It leered with selective sight. And yet, for the ordinary soul, punishment was real, immediate, terrifying. Imagine standing in a square, hearing your name called, knowing your neighbors would watch you whipped, or shaved, or branded. Imagine the heat of iron on flesh, the laughter of children as you screamed, the silence of those you once called friends. Desire, for all its sweetness, came chained to fear. You walk away from another scaffold, smoke rising behind you, and you feel the paradox settle heavy in your chest. Humanity has always sought to control desire, through herbs, through prayers, through cages and flames. Yet the punishments never erase lust. They only prove how powerful it is. Lust survives pillories, whips, drownings, fire. It survives mutilation and shame. It even survives execution. For every punished body becomes a story, and every story becomes a memory, and every memory keeps desire alive. The square grows quiet as the day ends. Villagers drift homeward, leaving only the stains of blood in the dirt, the ashes of flesh in the wind. Tomorrow, another punishment will come. Tomorrow, another body will suffer. But tonight, you sit in the dark and realize the truth. The harshest punishments were never about saving souls. They were about control. They were about reminding every man, every woman, that the body is never wholly theirs, that desire belongs to the law, to the church, to the crowd. To step outside is to risk everything. And yet, even under the threat of whip and flame, desire persisted. Lovers still touched hands in secret. Lips still found lips in the dark. The human heart, it seemed, could not be branded, caged, or silenced. The punishments, then, were not victories over lust. They were monuments to its endurance. The air grows thicker as you step off the square. The smell of blood lingers faintly in your nose, but soon it is overtaken by another smell, sweeter, muskier, laced with sweat and spiced wine. The sounds change too. The cries of punishment fade, replaced by the low hum of laughter, the tinkling of bells, the plucked string of a lute. you have wandered into a different theatre. One hidden in the shadows of punishment, the brothel. No city was without them. From Rome's Suburra to London's Bankside. From the red alleys of Amsterdam to the hidden quarters of Constantinople, brothels thrived in the margins of respectability. They were condemned from pulpits, cursed by law, raided by magistrates, yet always tolerated, always returning. For no matter how harshly lust was punished in daylight, it was indulged in the dark. You push open a heavy wooden door. Inside, the air is close and warm, thick with incense meant to mask the scent of flesh. Women sit on benches, faces powdered, lips stained red, their eyes darting over newcomers. Men gather in corners, some drunk, some whispering nervously, some already vanishing behind curtains with their chosen companions. A woman with a veil glides past you, her laugh soft, her perfume sharp. This is no church, though here desire is worshipped more honestly. The brothel is a paradox, a space both despised and indispensable, condemned and relied upon. Cities needed them. They were pressure valves, places where lust could be contained, regulated, taxed. Many brothels were licensed, operating openly under the authority of town councils or kings. In 14th century Avignon, for example, the Pope himself sanctioned a municipal brothel, its profits feeding the city's coffers. Holy men condemned lust in sermons even as they counted its coins. In medieval London, brothels along Bankside were licensed by the Bishop of Winchester, who collected rents from the prostitutes, hence the nickname Winchester geese. These women were permitted to sell pleasure, yet were denied burial in consecrated ground, their bodies tossed into pits called the single woman's churchyard. Even in death, their profession marked them. They were needed, but never honored. The rules of brothels were strict. In some places, women were forbidden to wear fine clothes or jewelry, so they could never be mistaken for respectable wives. In others, they had to wear striped garments, like prisoners, a visible warning of their trade. They could not leave their quarters at night, lest they tempt men in the streets. In Venice, brothel women were required to bare their breasts from windows to advertise, yet forbidden to walk freely in public. Desire was permitted only in its cage, but within those walls, desire was raw, unmasked. In some rooms, women reclined on straw mattresses, their faces painted in crude parody of courtly beauty. In others, finer courtesans entertained with music, poetry, and conversation before yielding to flesh. The distinction was sharp. Prostitutes of the street served survival. Courtesans of the salon sold illusion. One was paid in coins, the other in jewels, titles, influence. Courtesans could wield power rivaling that of noblewomen. Veronica Franco in 16th century Venice became not only a famous courtesan but a poet, her sonnets mocking men who sought her bed. She entertained kings and dukes, traded wit as sharply as flesh, and left behind verses that still burn with irony and intelligence. Yet even she lived under threat. Denounced before the Inquisition for witchcraft, accused of corrupting men with demonic arts. For a courtesan who was too clever, too independent, there was always a noose waiting in the shadows. But for the ordinary prostitute, life was harsher still. Disease spread like fire in brothels. Syphilis, the great pox, ravaged bodies leaving ulcers, madness, death. By the 16th century, physicians debated whether it was a punishment sent from God, or a curse brought back from the New World. Either way, it stalked the brothels mercilessly, disfiguring the very bodies that earned survival. And yet, men came anyway. Soldiers, merchants, apprentices, noblemen, all came to the brothel, their coins buying temporary oblivion. Some sought pleasure, others power, still others companionship in lonely cities. Behind the curtains, bodies met not always in passion, but in weariness, hunger, or desperation. Lust was often less about fire than about escape. The church thundered against these houses of sin, but could never erase them. Augustine himself, centuries earlier, admitted that without prostitutes, lust would corrupt respectable women, and society itself might collapse. Remove prostitutes from human affairs, he wrote, and you will unsettle everything with lust. Better, it seemed, to cage desire than to unleash it. So brothels endured, their doors swinging open for centuries, even as their women were spat upon in daylight and sought in darkness. They became places of paradox, condemned, taxed, tolerated, raided, revived. The magistrate who whipped a man for adultery might himself keep a mistress in a nearby room. The priest who preached chastity might slip through a brothel door after midnight. Lust was punished in the square, but indulged in the alley. And brothels were not only places of women. Male prostitutes, though less often recorded, also plied their trade. In Renaissance Florence, infamous for its tolerance of same-sex relations, records show boys hired for wealthy patrons, their names hidden in judicial archives under veiled accusations of sodomy. In Ottoman Constantinople, coffee houses whispered with rumors of young male dancers hired as companions. Their performances a thin veil for transactions of flesh. The hypocrisy stretched across every culture. What was forbidden in law thrived in shadow. Yet, in the brothel, punishments were never far away. Raids came suddenly. Doors splintered. Women dragged into streets, men fined, imprisoned, or branded. Prostitutes were beaten, shaved, or exiled, their survival cut off at the whim of magistrates. And still, the doors reopened. Desire proved unkillable. For every brothel closed, another appeared. For every woman whipped, another took her place. What fascinates is how openly society relied on what it condemned. Prostitutes were necessary scapegoats. Lightning rods for lust, absorbing the sins of men so wives and daughters could remain pure. They were vilified to protect the illusion of chastity elsewhere. They were mocked, beaten, cast into pits, yet they carried the burden of lust for all. Step deeper now into the room. A candle burns low, shadows crawling over painted faces. A man laughs too loudly, coins scatter across the floor, a lute strikes an off-key chord. Somewhere a woman coughs, a ragged, wet sound that might never heal. A curtain closes. Behind it, another story begins, one that will end in sweat or in tears, in a handful of silver or in silence. You sit in the corner and realize here lies the other side of punishment. Not the whip, not the brand, but the sale. Society did not only destroy lust, it profited from it. The brothel, the shame mask, the scaffold, all were tools of the same system. Desire was to be controlled, regulated, displayed, punished, and purchased, never free, never wholly one's own. And yet, even in this cage, desire found ways to resist. A courtesan might mock her client in verse. A prostitute might whisper stories of his hypocrisy to others. Lovers might meet in defiance of rules, choosing passion over survival. The brothel was not only a cage, but also a stage, where the great hypocrisy of human lust played out night after night. The city sleeps, but the brothel does not. The bell in the tower strikes midnight, and the curtains rustle again. You watch as men come and go, women paint new smiles over old wounds, and the air grows heavier with smoke and musk. Somewhere in the square beyond, the gallows waits for tomorrow's sinners. But here, tonight, sin is bought and sold, measured in coins, swallowed in silence. The candles burn lower. The laughter softens, replaced by murmurs and sighs. Yet if you step back into the streets, you see how broad this theatre truly is. The brothel is only one chamber in a larger labyrinth. Desire seeped into every corner of history, into palaces, convents, monasteries, even battlefields. And where it seeped, so too did punishment follow, waiting with its whips and brands. For lust, in all its guises, was never content to remain in the dark. It left marks. Children born outside marriage, scandals whispered in court, priests caught in beds they swore to renounce. And when the marks became visible, society responded with fury. Consider the palaces of Renaissance Italy, where lust wore silks and jewels. Courtiers kept mistresses in secret apartments, and dukes paraded courtesans as if they were trophies. The line between wife and mistress blurred, but when politics demanded, punishments were swift. A noblewoman caught in adultery might find herself poisoned, strangled, or locked in a convent for life. The same society that tolerated its princes, open debauchery crushed women who mirrored it. Convents themselves often became strange theatres of desire. Behind cloister walls, forbidden passions burned quietly. Nuns exchanged letters filled with longing, kissed through veils, whispered confessions that blurred prayer and desire. The Inquisition archives preserve fragments of these confessions. Sister Benedetta Carlini in 17th century Italy, accused of seducing novices under the claim of visions. Her punishments were not public whips, but years of isolation, her voice silenced. Lust among the cloistered was not punished in spectacle, but buried alive, erased from memory. And yet, memory always resists, even in erasure whispers remain. Travel further east, and you find harems, palaces within palaces, cages gilded with silk. The Ottoman harem in Istanbul was both a sanctuary and a prison for women, guarded by eunuchs, ruled by hierarchy. For outsiders, it became the ultimate fantasy of lust. Western travelers spun tales of endless orgies, of sultans drowning in concubines. The reality was harsher. Many women there were slaves, taken in conquest, their lives defined by obedience and the hope of bearing a son strong enough to secure them influence. Lust was not theirs to choose, it was wielded upon them. And the punishments for disobedience were invisible, but final: a silken cord around the throat, a quiet burial, a new concubine replacing the old. The pattern is clear: lust could be indulged by the powerful, yet punished with ferocity when it broke rank or dared to equalize. A king's mistress was an ornament. A baker's wife who strayed could be stoned, drowned, or paraded in shame. Lust was permitted upward, but scourged downward. Street life revealed the same cruel paradox. In marketplaces across Europe, prostitutes sometimes advertised openly, wearing bells on their ankles or standing in windows with breasts bared. Yet the same streets hosted punishments for sexual crimes. Men and women whipped naked through the crowd, branded with hot irons for adultery, or forced to wear shame masks, shaped like pigs or demons. The city itself became a stage where lust was simultaneously sold and scourged. One of the strangest punishments was the cucking stool. In medieval towns, women accused of promiscuity or infidelity were strapped to a chair fixed on a long beam, then dunked repeatedly into rivers or ponds, while crowds jeered. Their crime was not murder, nor theft, but desire expressed outside sanctioned bonds. Water was supposed to wash away their lust, though more often it drowned them. Another was the bridle, or scoldsbrank, an iron cage clamped over the head, with a sharp plate shoved into the mouth to silence speech. Though often used on women accused of gossiping, it was also employed against women suspected of lust or adultery. The bridle forced silence, controlling not only the body but the very voice of the accused. It was a visible reminder that desire, spoken aloud, was intolerable. But punishments were not confined to women. Men, too, bore their share, particularly when their lust defied the sanctioned order. Records across medieval Europe describe executions for sodomy: men burned alive, hanged, or drowned, their bodies discarded as abominations. The Florentine archives of the 15th century are thick with cases of young apprentices and artisans accused of same-sex encounters. Some fined, others branded, others vanished into silence. The hypocrisy was stark. The same society that hired boys for pleasure in private condemned them in public. Even kings were not immune. Edward Tumblr of England, accused by chroniclers of excessive affection for his male favourites, became the target of scorn and political rebellion. His eventual murder, rumoured to involve a red-hot poker, though historians debate the truth, was shaped as a symbolic punishment for lusts that defied expectation. Whether the method is true or legend, the story reveals the cultural hunger to see lust violently repaid. Punishments could be grotesquely creative. In Germany, adulterous couples were sometimes bound naked back to back and paraded through towns, a living mockery of their forbidden union. In Russia, records speak of women accused of promiscuity being whipped while tied to posts in the snow, their flesh left raw against the cold. In France, men caught visiting prostitutes too frequently were sometimes forced to wear women's clothes in public humiliation. Lust was not simply chastised. It was made spectacle, transformed into theatre. And yet, even as the lash cracked and the shame masks clinked, lust never stopped thriving. The brothels reopened, the courtesans sang, the palaces filled with whispers. Punishment seemed only to sharpen the hunger, to make lust more dangerous, more clandestine, more powerful. What lingers most is the cruelty of the double standards. Lust in men was expected, even excused. Boys will be boys. Soldiers need relief. Princes must have heirs. Lust in women, however, was dangerous, monstrous, needing the lash, the dunking, the bridle. The history of lust's punishment is, in truth, a history of fear of women's autonomy, fear of passion breaking boundaries, fear of desire ungoverned by patriarchs and priests. And so, society struck with iron and rope, but always with trembling hands. For what they punished in public, they pursued in secret. The same bishop who condemned prostitutes taxed their brothels. The same magistrate who whipped adulterers hid mistresses in his house. The same kings who burned, sodomites, employed male favorites at court. This hypocrisy is what gives the punishments their peculiar horror. They were never truly about morality, they were about control. Lust was not punished because it was unnatural, but because it was ungoverned. Desire outside authority, outside the sanctioned bond of church and state, was dangerous. And so, the lash fell. Walk once more into the night. The brothel's lamps flicker, the scaffold waits in the square, the river glistens where dunking stools rest. The city breathes with contradictions. Desire bought and sold in alleys, punished in daylight, whispered about in cloisters. Lust was everywhere, unavoidable, eternal, and so, too, was the hand raised against it. You realize at last that the punishment of lust was not truly meant to kill it. Lust is immortal, woven into human sinew. The punishments were meant to remind, to terrify, to bend bodies back into their cages. But lust never stayed caged. It seeped through cracks, through veils, through walls, spilling into markets and palaces, singing in courtesans' songs, trembling in whispered confessions. It lived, always. And in the silence after the last whip crack, after the last candle gutters out in the brothel, you hear it still, the heartbeat of desire, stubborn, eternal, unbroken. The city sleeps, the gallows waits, the brothel door swings shut, and lust, punished, survives. The scent of roasting fat lingers in the air, thick as incense. The hall glows with torches, long tables groaning beneath platters of meat and baskets of bread. Cups brim with wine. The laughter of the rich swells, mingled with the clatter of knives tearing flesh from bone. Here, gluttony sits enthroned. To understand the punishments of excess, one must first stand in the banquet. For centuries, feasting was not merely nourishment. It was spectacle theatre, power made edible. Kings displayed their might not only in armor, but in how many courses they could command at table. Monks, sworn to asceticism, sometimes smuggled roasted goose into their refectories, shoving bones beneath their robes. Peasants watched from the shadows, stomachs gnawed by hunger, as nobles tossed away food enough to feed a village. Excess was visible, flaunted, and so were the fears it stirred. For gluttony was never simply about appetite. It was about the body unrestrained, the soul weighed down by flesh, the belly becoming a symbol of corruption. And when excess tipped into grotesque, society responded with disgust, satire, and at times violent correction. Picture a medieval feast: peacocks served whole, feathers gilded, their bodies stuffed with spiced meats. Pies from which live birds burst forth when cut, fluttering in the smoky hall. Wines coloured with honey, liquors thick as syrup. Guests ate until their faces flushed, until they staggered from the table. Chroniclers record nobles vomiting into gilded basins, so they could return and eat again. It was not hunger, it was ritual, domination, a declaration that they could consume endlessly while others starved. And yet, just outside these glowing halls, famine crept. In the 14th century, the Great Famine swept Europe, fields rotting under relentless rains. Peasants boiled grass, ground bark into flour, gnawed on leather belts. Some chronicles whisper of parents eating their children. While the poor clawed at roots, kings and bishops still feasted. The contrast burned into collective memory. One man's gluttony was another's death. Thus, gluttony became not only a sin but a crime of spectacle. In sermons, priests painted vivid images of the overpunished punished in hell, bellies split open, bodies gnawed by vermin, men forced to devour endless filth. Dante, ever the poet of punishment, set the gluttonous in his inferno beneath an endless rain of foul water, their bodies wallowing in mud, guarded by the monstrous Cerberus, their hunger eternal, never satisfied. But punishments were not confined to the imagination of poets. They took flesh. In medieval towns, gluttony was mocked and disciplined through public ritual. Carnival, those wild days before Lent, often turned the sin into parody. Effigies of fat men were paraded through the streets, stuffed with sausages and wineskins, only to be burned at the stake or drowned in rivers. The people cheered, laughing as symbols of excess were destroyed. It was not only a festival, it was a cleansing, a symbolic punishment of appetite, before the lean fasting of Lent. There were real bodies, too. Records survive of corpulent monks shamed in their monasteries, stripped of food, forced into penance fasts that bordered on starvation. In England, one abbot was described as so vast of belly he scarce fit through the choir door. His brothers, disgusted, confined him to his cell and rationed him bread and water until he wasted away. His size was not seen as misfortune, but as moral failure. a living embodiment of sin demanding correction. Satire was another weapon. Across Europe, woodcuts and paintings mocked the glutton as pig, like jowls sagging, hands clutching meat. In German prints of the 16th century, the Feast of Fools depicted men so fat they could barely rise from their chairs, their bellies bursting through torn tunics. Satire itself became punishment, the glutton rendered ridiculous, stripped of dignity. Their flesh turned to grotesque caricature, yet punishment could turn crueler. The ancient world left grim precedents. Roman banquets, though celebrated for decadence, also carried rituals of shame. Emperors like Vitellius, infamous for his feasts, became symbols of corruption. After his fall, chroniclers wrote with glee that he was mocked, dragged through the streets, his bloated body stabbed and tossed into the Tiber. His appetite became his legacy, his punishment eternal infamy. Later in the Renaissance, when famine stalked the land, authorities began cracking down on visible excess. Edicts forbade citizens from serving too many courses, from displaying too much meat, from drinking too much wine in public. Breaking these rules could bring fines, whippings, even imprisonment. Gluttony was not just a private failing. It was an affront to order, a provocation to the hungry masses. But gluttony's punishments reached even stranger forms. In Switzerland, records mention fasting chairs, where offenders accused of overindulgence were bound in public and denied food for days, displayed to the crowd as examples of restraint imposed. In Italy, gluttons might be forced to wear belts stuffed with sausages, paraded like grotesque effigies of their own sin. And still, the hunger of the poor sharpened the spectacle. The punishments of gluttony often turned into theatre for the starving. To see a fat man mocked, stripped, denied food, was to see justice performed. To see the symbol of excess humiliated was to taste a fleeting rebalancing of the world. Perhaps the most haunting punishments came not from courts, but from famine itself. When the Black Death struck, survivors often wrote that the fat and overfed died most quickly. Chroniclers painted it as poetic justice. The rich who had stuffed themselves on meat and wine were the first to rot. The image of the swollen corpse, purple with plague, became the ultimate punishment for gluttony. Death itself enforced equality at last, but gluttony never vanished. Even as famine struck, new feasts rose. The cycle repeated endlessly: indulgence, hunger, punishment, indulgence again. The human stomach became a theatre of sin, a stage where justice and appetite wrestled without end. And here, at the midpoint of our descent, you realize that gluttony was never simply about food. It was about appetite in all its forms. The desire for more, always more. For food, for drink, for wealth, for sensation. And those who consumed too much were not only mocked or punished, they were feared. A glutton devoured not just meat, but balance, justice, the fragile order of a starving world. And so society struck them down, in satire, in law, in ritual fire. Yet always the feasts returned. Always the meat roasted. Always the wine flowed. For appetite is as immortal as lust, and punishments could only delay, never destroy. The feast ends, as all feasts do, with silence. The torches gutter out, the tables are bare save for gnawed bones, half-drunk cups of wine, crusts tossed to the dogs. The air hangs heavy with the smell of grease. Here lies the aftermath of gluttony, not the glow of indulgence, but the ruin it leaves behind. And here, too, came punishment. In cities across medieval Europe, waste itself was treated as evidence of sin. Piles of discarded food outside a lord's hall were reminders of how much had been consumed and how much denied to others. Sometimes mobs rose, dragging stewards and cooks into the streets, pelting them with the very scraps of food they had squandered. In Florence, one baker who refused to lower bread prices during famine was seized by an angry crowd, stripped, and forced to eat loaves soaked in vinegar until he vomited, before being beaten bloody. Excess and its cruelty were policed by hunger itself. The authorities knew this danger. That is why so many edicts attempted to regulate feasting. In England, the Statute of Diet forbade extravagant banquets and endless meats at weddings and funerals. In Milan, civic councils limited how many courses could be served, how much wine poured, and even how large the pies could be. Breaking these laws was treated like a crime against the body politic. Too much appetite, it was feared, could spark riot as quickly as any heresy. Yet, as always, the punishments turned theatrical. The theatre of sin demanded spectacle, demanded laughter, demanded grotesque inversion. Carnival, with its parody of gluttony, was not merely comic, it was a sanctioned punishment of appetite. The fat fool, the drunken priest, the pig-masked reveller. They were mocked, chased, sometimes beaten in the streets. The symbolic king of gluttony was often drowned, burned, or hanged in effigy. Appetite, made flesh, was ritually slain. The punishments grew stranger still. In parts of Germany, a device known as the beer stool, a stool shaped like a giant beer mug, was used to shame drunkards and gluttons. Offenders were strapped inside, paraded through the town, their heads poking from the rim, while jeering crowds pelted them with rotten eggs and spoiled meat. In some towns, swine parades were inflicted. The accused was dressed in pig skins and forced to crawl through the streets, snorting while townsfolk laughed and spat. Appetite was punished by turning man into beast. And yet the punishments never truly matched the dread that gluttony inspired in the imagination of preachers. For in the sermons of medieval Europe, the glutton's fate was far worse than public humiliation. It was eternal torment. Dante had given us the image of the endless, freezing rain, the mud, the beast Cerberus clawing at the bloated dead. But others went further. In vision literature, the fantastical accounts of hell written by monks and mystics, gluttons were shown force, fed boiling pitch, molten lead, or live toads. Their bellies burst open, entrails spilling, only to be restored and torn again. Some were hung upside down, their mouths stuffed endlessly with ordure. One 15th century preacher declared, "As they filled themselves with meat, so shall they be filled with filth." The logic was relentless. The mouth, the belly, the organs of desire must be the site of their torture. Appetite turned inward, transformed into suffering. Consider the case of Saint Benedict's vision, told by Gregory the Great. A monk, secretly gluttonous, died without repentance. Benedict saw his soul dragged into hell, chained by his tongue, which had loved taste too much. The tongue was nailed to the ground, trodden by demons. Punishment fit the crime. But earthly authorities borrowed these images too. In Spain, the Inquisition sometimes included gluttony in its catalogue of sins to be confessed. Those who admitted excess might be sentenced to public penance, fasting for months, pilgrimages on bread and water, or, if they mocked the order, stricter humiliations like wearing collars shaped as swine snouts. The Church ensured that appetite was not only a danger to the soul, but a wound to the body here and now. There is a darker undertone beneath all this punishment. For gluttony was never just about food. It was about control. To punish the glutton was to reassert boundaries between rich and poor, between body and spirit, between desire and restraint. The starving needed to believe that the overfed would pay, if not in this life then in the next. And the powerful needed to remind their subjects that even feasting had limits, even indulgence could be stripped, mocked, or burned away. Sometimes, though, the punishment came not from priests or magistrates, but from the body itself. Physicians in the Middle Ages loved to describe the ailments of gluttons: gout, apoplexy, bloating, suffocation. In popular tales, the fat man who stuffed himself often died at the table, choking on his own excess. The punishment required no executioner. Death itself laughed at the feast. One chronicler tells of a Bavarian knight so voracious that he ordered 20 courses each night. At last, his stomach ruptured mid-banquet, spilling its contents onto the table. His corpse was left for the dogs, for no one dared bury him. Stories like these spread as moral warnings. Gluttony devours itself. And yet, strangely, there was also fascination. The grotesque body of the glutton became an object of wonder, of fear, even of grim entertainment. In fairs, fat men and giant eaters were displayed in cages, paid to devour whole chickens, hogs' heads, towers of bread, while gawking crowds laughed and recoiled. Their bodies were punishment and spectacle, at once living warnings of appetite unrestrained. The cycle never ended. Hunger and excess danced endlessly together. In years of plenty, the feasts grew grotesque. Monstrous pies, wine flowing in fountains, sugar sculptures taller than men. In years of famine, punishment fell, mockery, starvation, riot, even lynching. Appetite swelled, appetite was cut down, and always the stomach ruled. And beyond it all, hell waited, with its eternal banquets of filth. The imagination of gluttony was never just earthly. It reached forward into the grave, into eternity. The belly was not only the site of appetite, it was the trapdoor to damnation. So we return to the silence after the feast, to the bones left for the dogs, to the scraps rotting in the gutter. Punishment clings to the very air. It lingers in the stench of decay, in the whispers of the hungry, in the sermons that promise torment. It lingers in the laughter of carnival, in the jeers at the pig-paraded fool. The sin of gluttony was never simply punished. It was remembered, retold, immortalized. For every feast must end, and every appetite must pay its due. The mouth that devours will one day be forced to swallow ashes. The belly that swells will one day be split. The banquet always carries the shadow of the scaffold. And thus, gluttony's story becomes the story of human appetite itself. Always sought, always feared, always indulged, always punished. Always reborn in new forms, new feasts, new excesses. The punishment is eternal because the hunger is eternal. And as you close your eyes, you might still hear the echoes, the laughter of nobles drunk on wine, the groans of peasants gnawing bark, the jeers of crowds pelting a fat man in a pig's skin. The feast, the famine, the punishment, they never truly end. The hall is empty now. The torches are out. The scraps rot. And in the silence, the sin of appetite lingers, waiting for its next mouth, its next belly, its next body to punish. The hall has gone dark, yet the memory of feasting lingers like grace on the lips. But appetite alone was not the end of sin. What followed gluttony, more insidious and more dreadful, was what men poured into their cups. For if the belly was the vessel of indulgence, then the chalice was its accomplice. To drink was no mere act of thirst. It was an invocation, a ritual, a danger. The medieval world feared not only excess of food but the intoxication of drink. And beyond that, more terrible still, the poisoned cup. The cup was always a symbol of power. In courts and monasteries alike, the one who poured held authority over the one who drank. Kings appointed cupbearers, trusted men, whose entire duty was to ensure the drink was pure, free of poison, safe from betrayal. So common was the fear that entire offices of state revolved around guarding the cup. At the tables of Byzantium, eunuchs held the chalice, believing that their lack of heirs made them incorruptible. In England, the royal butler was no mere servant, but a high noble charged with tasting every drop before it touched the king's lips. The drink itself was often treacherous. Wine, beer, and all were rarely pure. They sword-turned, or were cut with herbs to disguise rot. Monks who brewed were praised for the purity of their drink, while tavern keepers were scorned as adulterers, stretching ale with ditch water, spicing it with bitter roots. But in every draught there lurked a deeper suspicion. What if the bitterness masked not corruption, but venom? The poisoned cup was the great terror of medieval courts. Chronicles are filled with whispered tales of monarchs, dukes, and bishops felled not by sword or spear, but by a draught of wine. Some deaths are likely myth, others real. Popes died suddenly at banquets, Byzantine emperors fell ill at feasts, Russian princes collapsed after drinking mead. No wound, no blade, only the hidden hand of poison. The punishments for such crimes were fittingly theatrical. Those accused of poisoning were burned alive, for fire was seen as the only element capable of purging their sin. In Venice, poisoners were bound in chains and drowned in the lagoon. In France, the executioner sometimes forced the condemned to swallow their own concoction before the crowd. Punishment became spectacle. The cup turned back upon its bearer. Yet the poisoned cup was not only a courtly dread, it seeped into the imagination of the masses. Preachers used it as metaphor for sin itself. To drink greedily of desire was to sip poison. To let temptation pass your lips was to swallow damnation. The chalice in hell, they warned, was not filled with wine but with molten lead, gall, and serpents. The drunkard and the glutton alike would thirst forever, yet never drink without agony. Even in earthly ritual, the cup was double-edged. Communion itself, the holiest of sacraments, required wine. Yet what was this wine but blood? And what was blood but the most terrifying of drinks? The faithful were told to sip reverently, yet always with trembling, for to drink unworthily was to damn oneself. The chalice on the altar was salvation to some, poison to others. The very act of raising the cup contained within it both blessing and curse. But beyond the church, beyond the courts, the tavern was where drink turned most dangerous. Taverns were seen as nests of sin, brawls, fornication, gambling, and of course drunkenness. The punishments for tavern excess were brutal. In parts of Germany, a drunkard might be strapped into the drunkard's cloak, A heavy barrel with holes cut for arms and legs, forced to stumble through the streets as children jeered. In England, alehouse brawlers were dunked in the cucking, stool plunged into the village pond to cool their thirst. The body that drank too deeply was humiliated, paraded, drowned. And yet taverns thrived. The poor needed them as refuge, the soldier as comfort, the pilgrim as shelter. Even monasteries brewed casks of ale for their guests, knowing that bread alone could not soothe the soul. Drink was sin and sacrament both, poison and medicine, indulgence and cure. The contradiction only deepened its hold on the medieval imagination. What of Hell's Tavern? Preachers delighted in describing it. In one vision, sinners sat around a table, thirsting. Demons brought them cups brimming with bile and writhing worms. They were forced to drink, coughing, gagging, only for the cups to refill endlessly. The sin of drink was punished with an eternity of poisoned cups. Dante himself placed the drunkards and gluttons together, grovelling in the mire, their mouths filled with foul rain. The tavern of the damned never closed. But perhaps the most unsettling truth was this: the poisoned cup was not always literal. It was also symbolic of power, of betrayal, of the treachery that lurked within human society. To drink from another's hand was to trust. To lift the chalice was to surrender. To poison the cup was to break the most intimate covenant. The poisoned cup was therefore the image of sin itself, alluring, glittering, sweet on the lips, yet deadly in the gut. And so, medieval man feared it everywhere. In the banquet hall, where rival lords smiled across the table, their fingers itching toward hidden vials. In the tavern, where a stranger might offer you a friendly drink. Even in the church, where the chalice itself demanded faith, that what it contained was salvation and not doom. Thus, punishment of drink was always about more than mere intoxication. It was about trust, betrayal, and the fragility of the body. For every draught could be your last, and every cup might carry damnation. And as we linger now in the silence of these halls, we can almost hear the faint echo of cups clinking, of laughter turning to coughs, of gasps and collapses. The poisoned cup was everywhere, invisible, waiting. The cup, once raised, became an object of theatre. At every banquet, eyes followed the motion of the chalice. Did the Lord sip deeply, or only touch it to his lips? Did he smile after drinking, or falter? Was the wine warm, too sweet, strangely bitter? A court could fall into silence over a single sip, for the poisoned cup was not only feared, it was expected. Chronicles loved to whisper of poisonings. In Rome, they accused Livia, wife of Augustus, of dispatching rivals with tinctures slipped into figs and wine. In the Byzantine court, rumor claimed poison traveled faster than the sword. Emperors collapsed after feasts. Generals died in mid-toast. Patriarchs sickened after the Eucharist. Catherine de' Medici, centuries later, would inherit the same reputation, her name bound forever to powders, perfumed gloves, and goblets lined with venom. But the line between truth and tale blurred. Many deaths in the medieval world came suddenly, without explanation. Illnesses struck in hours, food spoiled in days. A fever could kill as swiftly as a poison. Yet in the imagination of people who lived daily with betrayal, poison was always more satisfying to believe. It made death personal. It made every banquet a game of masks. So it was that kings surrounded themselves with tasters, men who drank first and lived or died in their lord's place. To be a taster was both an honor and a death sentence. In Byzantium, the office of the epituscoites, keeper of the cup, was second only to the emperor himself. In England, the royal butler held lands and titles simply for lifting chalices to his lips before the king did. The very intimacy of sharing a drink became the strongest form of loyalty, or the cruelest trick. The fear of poisoning changed the design of cups themselves. In the treasuries of Europe survived bizarre contraptions, goblets shaped with double walls, meant to catch hidden powders, crystal chalices thought to shatter in contact with venom, horns carved with runes to ward off witchcraft. Unicorn horns, in particular, were prized as antidotes, though in truth they were narwhal tusks from the icy seas of Greenland. Still, kings would dip them into their wine, believing the ivory would sweat or fizz in the presence of poison. And yet, beyond the glittering halls, the tavern held its own kind of poison. Ale and beer were safer to drink than water, but only just. Taverns diluted their brews, adding soot dregs or bitter herbs. Medieval authorities complained constantly of the adulterated drink, that left men sick, weak, or mad. In this sense, every tavern cup was already poisoned, not with venom, but with filth. To drink deep was to court illness, and still they drank. The punishments for drunkenness bordered on cruelty. The barrel punishment, known as the drunkard's cloak, was infamous in the German states. A hollowed cask strapped to the body, so the offender waddled through the streets, a spectacle of shame. In Scotland, some towns dunked offenders headfirst into icy rivers, holding them down until sputtering. In Russia, the Tsar Peter the Great invented the drunkard's collar, a massive iron weight shaped like a goblet, locked around the neck of chronic drunkards, forcing them to stumble under its burden. Drink's punishment was to turn the body into mockery. In England, alehouse brawlers were bound to the cucking stool. Not unlike the punishments of women deemed scolds, the drunkard was seated on a wooden chair chained, then swung over a pond or river. The chair was plunged down, water rushing into nose and lungs, before being lifted out again to the laughter of the crowd. The message was clear. He who thirsted too deeply would drink against his will, drowning in humiliation. But humiliation was not always enough. Chronic drunkards were branded, flogged, or even executed if their brawls led to bloodshed. In monastic codes, brothers who grew drunk were stripped of rank, beaten with rods, or cast out into exile. Drink was no light offense. It was the gateway to every other sin, lust, violence, sloth, heresy. A man who drank was a man undone. And yet wine was sacred. Ale sustained the poor. Beer built the monasteries. The paradox deepened with every sip. The cup was sin, but the cup was salvation. How could both be true? Preachers resolved it with terrifying imagery. The tavern of earth, they said, was only a pale imitation of the tavern of hell. There, demons were innkeepers. The drunkard staggered to the counter, begged for drink, and was handed goblets filled with gall, scorpions, or molten metal. Once swallowed, the drink burst their entrails, yet their thirst only grew. Thus the punishment of drink was thirst eternal, each cup more foul than the last, each gulp more agonizing. Such visions terrified, but also fascinated. To imagine hell as a tavern was to understand sin in its most familiar form. Men did not fear the strange or exotic. They feared what they knew. And every man, from lord to serf, had raised a cup. We cannot help but notice how often betrayal took the form of drink. The poisoned chalice was the weapon of choice for the ambitious, the desperate, the weak who could not wield the sword. It required no army, no rebellion, no open violence. Only patience, and a vial of dust. That was its genius and its terror. Even in literature, the poisoned cup became emblem. Shakespeare would seize it centuries later in Hamlet, the king undone by wine. But the imagery was already ancient. The chalice of betrayal, of sin, of inevitable death, haunted every culture. It was universal because it was intimate. Consider the feast. 100 candles, tapestries dripping from the walls, servants scurrying with silver dishes. Music plays, laughter rises. And then, one guest falters. A cough, a gasp, a face gone pale. Silence falls. The poisoned cup has found its mark. Suddenly every guest stares at their own goblet with dread. Did they drink too? Who poured it? Who brought the wine? The feast is ruined. Joy turned to terror. This scene played out not only in chronicles but in imagination, over and over, until even the most innocent drink was shadowed by fear. And it lingers still. We raise glasses today in toast, in weddings, in celebrations. But the language we use, "Here's to your health," betrays the echo of the old fear. For health was never certain, and every drink could be the last. The medieval imagination, steeped in guilt and suspicion, turned the cup into a stage of morality. Drink could bind men in fellowship, or betray them in silence. It could sustain the body, or unmake it. It could unite in Christ, or damn in excess. In every sip there was danger. And so, the chapter of the poisoned cup closes not with peace, but with unease. Imagine it now. The fire crackles low, the table is littered with bones, the last candle gutters. Before you rests a single chalice. You lift it, heavy, cold in the hand. You wonder who poured this. What lies within? Salvation or doom? It is the same question every medieval soul asked, again and again. And in the silence, in the flicker of the candle, you realize this: the cup is never empty. Imagine a long oak table, polished with age, set with trenchers, goblets, and steaming platters. The feast is ready, candles flicker, servants bow. And yet, the seats stand empty. Not because the lords have not arrived, but because they will never arrive again. The plague has taken them. The feast is cold. The table waits. This was the image that haunted medieval Europe again and again, the table deserted by death. No banquet was safe, no household immune. The Black Death crept into halls as easily as it did cottages, and it left its mark not only on the body, but on the ritual of dining itself. Food and pestilence were bound in memory, and even centuries later, whispers of the plague table echo in the chronicles of fear. The connection between plague and the table is deeper than it first appears. Feasts were the heartbeat of medieval life, whether in a noble court, a monastery refectory, or the humble gatherings of peasants. To sit at table was to be human, to be part of a body larger than oneself. To eat together was to confirm one's place in the world. And so when plague swept through, the disruption of meals became as terrifying as the corpses in the street. To dine without company, to stare at an empty seat, was to feel death as intimately as if it sat across from you. Chronicles describe cities where banquets were abandoned mid-course. Guests fell suddenly ill, coughing blood onto their bread, their spoons dropping from trembling fingers. Servants rushed to clear plates, only to find themselves struck down before the trenchers were emptied. The table, once laden with abundance, became an altar of decay. Meat cooled and rotted, bread grew stale and hard, wine soured in the cup. The feast itself seemed cursed, and yet feasting did not cease. Humans cling to ritual even in catastrophe. Nobles still held banquets during plague years, as if defiance could drive back the invisible enemy. Records from Florence, Paris, and London all describe lords and ladies eating lavishly, while the streets outside groaned with the dying. To eat was to insist on life. But the food carried new weight: the roasted boar, the sweetmeats, the spiced wine, all became symbols of fragile mortality. Each bite was shadowed by the knowledge that tomorrow's meal might never come. The plague table also shifted the way meals were imagined in art and religion. The Last Supper of Christ, already central to Christian thought, became intertwined with plague fears. To picture Christ surrounded by disciples was to picture also the risk of sudden loss. One of you will betray me. Yes, but equally, one of you will die before the meal is done. Painters, in the centuries after plague, often showed the disciples with weary, hollow faces, as though sickness had already touched them. The Eucharist itself, bread and wine offered daily, became both comfort and terror. Was it salvation, or was it the cup of death? Among common folk, the plague table was simpler, but no less haunted. Villagers described meals eaten in silence. Each family seated around bread that no one dared break, waiting for the sound of a cough, the sight of a fevered brow. Children stared at the food, too frightened to eat. In some accounts, neighbors left bread and ale at each other's doors, unwilling to share a table for fear of infection. The shared meal, the foundation of community, collapsed under the shadow of pestilence. But fear also gave rise to grotesque reversals. There were those who, convinced that death was inevitable, plunged into gluttony. In Florence, Boccaccio's Decameron describes young nobles who, fleeing the city, retreated to villas and held feasts of pleasure, eating, drinking, and telling stories while the plague raged outside. Chroniclers condemn these feasts of death, where tables groaned with food not as a celebration of life, but as a denial of death. Bread, wine, and roasted meats became a kind of charm against despair, a desperate attempt to drown out the silence of the grave with laughter and indulgence. Even in monasteries, the plague table left its mark. Refectories that once rang with chants fell silent as brothers died one after another. Surviving monks recorded the eerie stillness of long wooden tables where half the benches stood empty. Some wrote of the practice of setting bread, and all before the empty places, not to waste food, but to remind the living of the absent dead. These ghost meals blurred the line between the sacred duty of prayer and the human grief of hunger and loss. The terror of shared meals transformed law as well. Cities passed ordinances limiting banquets, fearing contagion spread not only by bodies but by food itself. Taverns were shuttered, alehouses fined. In London, officials ordered that no more than a handful of guests could gather at table. In Venice, feasts were outlawed altogether during plague years. To eat together became a crime against health. And yet, behind closed doors, families still gathered, whispering prayers over bread and wine, hoping death would pass them by. The symbolism of the table also turned apocalyptic. Preachers thundered from pulpits that the plague table was the punishment of God, that those who had feasted too richly in life would be fed with bitterness in death. They painted visions of hell as banquets of mockery, tables set with golden platters, but upon them only filth and worms, goblets brimming, but filled with gall. Demons served food that devoured rather than nourished, and the damned were trapped in endless hunger. To hear such sermons was to glance at one's own dinner with unease, for perhaps it too concealed rot beneath its surface. And yet, the resilience of humanity showed even in this. In village festivals that resumed after plague years, the memory of absence made feasts sweeter. Chronicles speak of gatherings where people wept openly as bread was broken, grateful to have survived long enough to taste it again. They toasted not only to health, but to the dead, pouring wine onto the ground for those who no longer sat at the table. The plague had hollowed their meals, but it had also deepened their meaning. The plague table, then, is not merely an image of death. It is also an image of survival. It shows us that even when the world collapsed, people clung to the act of sitting, eating, and sharing. In bread and wine they found both doom and defiance. The table was never empty for long, and in this tension, between absence and abundance, fear and fellowship, we glimpse the medieval soul laid bare. They feasted at the edge of the grave, and in doing so, taught us something timeless. Every meal is fragile, every seat is temporary, every table, in time, becomes a plague table. The memory of the plague table did not fade when the epidemic waned. It lingered in the way people looked at bread, wine, and meat. It lingered in superstitions about what could and could not be eaten, and in whispers about cursed banquets where laughter had turned into moaning, where the clatter of knives and spoons had ended in silence. In some towns, people began to avoid certain foods altogether. Garlic, onions, and leeks, long believed to purify the air and body, were consumed with feverish devotion. But pork, beef, and rich pies became feared by some, thought to weigh down the body and make it more vulnerable to plague. In the countryside, shepherds described herds of sheep, mysteriously dying after feeding on lush grass, and rumors spread that plague seeped not only through the air, but through food itself. A simple loaf of bread could become the instrument of death. Monastic chronicles capture this fear in quiet detail. A monk in Burgundy wrote of a refectory meal in which, one by one, brothers laid down their spoons and rose pale and trembling from the table. By nightfall, 10 of them were dead. He concluded that the bread was poisoned, not by human hands, but by the breath of pestilence. Others agreed, noting that food left uncovered in a plague struck town seemed to spoil faster, as though the air itself were heavy with invisible corruption. It is easy to dismiss such fears now, but for them, each meal was a gamble, a wager with the unseen. And because of this, the table itself took on a sacred trade. To set it was to risk, to sit was to invite, to eat was to accept. Among nobles, the response was often theatrical. Some lords and ladies took to dining alone, in sealed chambers perfumed with herbs. Their tables were laid with roasted pheasants and gilded meats, but no guest shared them. Chronicles describe them eating with gloves, their fingers never touching food, servants forced to carry dishes at arm's length, veils draped over platters as if even the air could not be trusted. The feast became a fortress, but also a prison, for eating in solitude stripped the meal of its meaning. What is a banquet without witness? What is wine without a companion to raise a glass in return? Others, however, doubled down on fellowship. "If I am to die," one Venetian merchant was quoted as saying, "let it be with bread in my hand and friends at my side." In his account, he described long nights of eating, drinking, and singing while plague bells tolled outside. They knew the risk. They chose the table anyway. To break bread in the company of others was to reclaim humanity in defiance of the void. There were stranger responses still. In Nuremberg, some families began setting out an extra place at table, not for a guest, but for the plague itself. The empty plate was left untouched, a symbolic offering, a way of saying you may eat with us, but leave us unharmed. These, death seats, appear in several chronicles, though whether they were widespread or only rumor is hard to say. But the image is chilling. The family seated in fear, chewing silently, while across from them an empty seat waited, as if an invisible diner might arrive at any moment. It was not only in homes that plague warped dining. Public feasts, once held to honor saints or guilds, became macabre spectacles. In Milan, during a respite year, a feast was held in honor of Saint Roch, the patron saint of plague victims. But when the food was served, witnesses said the crowd fell into silence. Every platter seemed too full, every goblet too bright, as if mocking the memory of famine and death. Some guests claimed they could smell not spices, but decay. What should have been a joyful gathering became haunted, the table groaning not with abundance but with memory. Artists absorbed this imagery and transformed it. In illuminated manuscripts, feasts were painted with figures pale and gaunt, sometimes skeletons themselves, seated alongside the living. The dance macabre, that famous medieval motif of the dance of death, often included tables where kings and peasants dined together, only for skeletons to snatch the bread from their hands. The table became the stage of mortality, where rank and wealth meant nothing, and all were equal before the unseen guest. Theological writers, too, seized on the symbolism. For them, the plague table revealed the futility of earthly abundance. 1,000 loaves cannot feed the soul, wrote one preacher in Cologne. 1,000 cups cannot quench its thirst. The feast is vanity, the table a coffin. Such sermons struck hard at listeners who had once measured wealth in banquets, status in the number of guests seated at their boards. To hear that even the richest feast could not defend against plague was to feel the table itself hollow beneath one's hands. Yet alongside the sermons of despair, there were gentler voices. Some chroniclers wrote of tables that became sites of healing. When famine followed plague, neighbors pooled what little food they had. Sitting shoulder to shoulder, their meager bread stretched thin but made sweeter by sharing. Mothers gave their portion to children, fathers to widows, communities to the sick. These humble meals, stripped of pomp, became the quiet counterweight to the death feasts of the wealthy. If the plague table could symbolize doom, it could also symbolize care. One story from an English parish tells of a widow who baked a loaf each day and placed it on the steps of the church. No one saw her eat. No one saw her keep any bread for herself. But the village survived, and afterward, they swore that her offerings had been blessed, that death had passed them by, because one woman turned her table into an altar of charity. Whether the tale is legend or truth, it shows how powerfully the image of the table lived in the medieval mind. There were also dark rumors of tables cursed not by plague, but by betrayal. In France, tales spread of families who had locked their doors against neighbors begging for food, only to find their own tables overturned by unseen hands, their bread blackened overnight, their wine soured. Such stories taught a moral lesson: to deny bread was to invite a curse. In this way, the table became not only a place of risk, but of judgment. As plague ebbed and returned in waves, new rituals clung to meals. Some households began the custom of covering the bread with a cloth before eating, lifting it only after prayer. Some refused to drink from shared cups. Others, paradoxically, insisted that every guest must drink from the same cup, as a pledge of trust, as if to say we live or die together. The long memory of the plague table stretched into later centuries. In the 17th century, when new waves of pestilence struck, diaries still record fear of empty chairs, of spoiled feasts, of sudden silence at the board. Even when medical theories shifted, the imagery remained. The table had become a stage upon which death always threatened to appear. And perhaps that is why the image endures even now. We still set tables. We still mark absence by empty seats. We still feel the weight of silence when someone who once dined with us is gone. The medieval plague table was not unique. It was simply sharper, darker, more immediate. But its shadow reaches across centuries. To imagine that table, candles guttering, trenchers waiting, cups half full, and no diners left alive, is to imagine not only the Black Death, but the essence of human fragility. The feast is never guaranteed. The chair is never ours forever. The bread may crumble before we can break it. And so the chapter closes as it began, with an empty hall, a silent table, and a lesson whispered by centuries of absence. To eat is to live. To eat together is to hope. But to look upon an empty chair is to remember that every meal is temporary, and that one day, the plague, or something like it, will set its place among us again. It is often said that the past survives in stone and parchment, in monuments and chronicles. Yet there is another, quieter archive, an archive of shadows. Not the shadows cast by light upon a wall, fleeting and weightless, but the shadows left behind when lives are erased, when voices fall silent, when histories crumble into dust. These are not always recorded in ink. Sometimes they linger in the margins of manuscripts, sometimes in the creak of abandoned floorboards, sometimes in the faint outline of a hand pressed centuries ago into plaster. The Black Death, which tore so violently through Europe, left such shadows everywhere it touched, and many of them gathered in the libraries, scriptoria, and treasuries of the written word. For the monastic world, the plague was not only a terror of flesh, but a famine of knowledge. Entire scriptoria fell silent. Where once the scratch of quills echoed through long wooden halls, now there was only the shuffle of feet carrying bodies to graves. The monastic scribe, bent over his vellum, knew that the sentence he copied might be his last, and when he fell, the page might remain unfinished, the last words trailing into nothing, the ink spreading like a wound. Such abandoned manuscripts still survive. There are codices with sudden blanks, where margins widen into emptiness, where a single half-formed letter is frozen forever, a life cut short mid-line. Scholars who study these interrupted works often remark on their eerie quality. One such manuscript, in the British Library, contains a psalter written in a neat, practiced hand, until halfway through the Psalms, the script abruptly stops. No colophon, no closure, no change of ink. Just a sudden white silence, as though the scribe had vanished from the room. Marginal notes added later, in a different hand attempt to finish the text. But the rhythm is broken, the flow disrupted. What lingers most is not the words themselves, but the absence of the original writer. He is there and then gone, leaving only his shadow behind. Libraries themselves became repositories of such absences. Shelves built to hold the voices of the dead began to hold the silences of the recently departed. In Paris, Oxford, Bologna, and Padua, university libraries saw their populations of scholars decimated. The books remained, lined in quiet rows, but the hands that should have turned them were buried. Imagine walking through such a library in 1315, the dust undisturbed, the lamps unlit, the benches empty, a student's parchment notes, abandoned mid-argument, curling at the edges where ink had not dried evenly. A lecture's text copied in haste, but never concluded. The silence of such places would not have been merely physical. It would have been crushing, as though the walls themselves remembered every vanished voice. Some contemporaries were aware of this haunting. A chronicler in Florence wrote that the city's schools and studies were widowed. He describes books, waiting like orphans, on their shelves, neglected while pestilence prowled outside. The simile is striking, books themselves imagined as children abandoned, hungry for attention, but left unread, untouched, unloved. And so, the libraries of Europe were filled not with chatter, but with shadows. But shadows have their own strange persistence. While some texts fell silent, others came alive in unexpected ways. The very horror of the plague drove people to write. Survivors locked in their chambers or fleeing across empty roads poured thoughts into parchment with feverish energy. They described visions, omens, remedies, prayers, and dreams. They wrote of the silence of their towns, the stench of their streets, the ringing of plague bells in the distance. And yet, not all of these writings were preserved. Many were lost, forgotten, or consumed by time. What we have are fragments, and these fragments, too, are shadows, partial, incomplete, suggesting more than they reveal. There is one particularly haunting fragment from Loewe Beck. A short text, perhaps intended as a sermon, survives in only a single copy. It describes the plague as a shadow that eats the body from within, a phrase so visceral it feels almost modern. But the text breaks off abruptly after just a few sentences. We do not know the rest of the sermon. We do not know whether it offered hope or despair. We only know that someone, at some point, thought it important enough to write down, and someone else, at some point, thought it important enough to copy. And then it faded, leaving only a shadow of thought. This is the nature of shadow history. It is made not only of what was written, but of what was lost. The empty space where the rest of the page should have been. The shelf where a book once stood before fire or flood, or neglect consumed it. The silent stretch of years where no voices speak. Shadows do not shout, they whisper. They suggest, hint, linger. They are the ghosts of memory. Even the physical libraries bore their marks. Some monasteries and universities, struggling to maintain their numbers, closed their scriptoria altogether. In a monastery near Dijon, the scriptorium fell into disuse for nearly a century. When monks finally returned to it, they found the benches rotted, the shelves warped, the once bright windows now thick with grime. The room itself had become a kind of tomb. A library of shadows where no hand stirred the dust. Later accounts describe monks entering the room and feeling the weight of absence, as though the ghosts of their predecessors lingered in the silence. But absence is not only found in empty shelves. It can also be seen in how books themselves were handled during the plague years. Many manuscripts from this period contain marginal prayers, short invocations written between the lines, asking for protection from pestilence. These were not part of the original text, but desperate additions by readers whose hands trembled as they wrote. In one manuscript of Gregory's Moralia, the reader scrawled, "Lord, deliver us from sudden death," across a page describing Job's suffering. The hand is uneven, the letters rushed. It is as though the reader could not help but respond, could not allow the text to remain passive while death prowled outside the cloister. Such interventions are shadows of another kind, shadows of fear, scratched into the margins of eternity. It is tempting to think of libraries as places of stability, guardians of memory. But in the 14th century they were fragile things. Rats chewed at bindings, damp warped parchment, fire and war consumed collections, and plague carried away the custodians. For every great library that survived, countless smaller ones were lost, leaving behind only hints. We know, for instance, of a physician in Narbonne who kept a private collection of medical treatises, said to contain recipes for antidotes and plague remedies. When he and his household perished, his collection disappeared. Did it burn? Was it looted? Was it simply left to rot? We do not know. What remains is only the rumor of the books, a library of shadows. And yet, shadows are not nothing. They shape perception. They remind us of what was once present. To walk through a medieval library during or after the plague would have been to feel surrounded by presences, both visible and invisible. The parchment bore the words of the long dead, the empty benches bore the absence of the newly dead. Each shadow was a reminder of mortality. The image of the library of shadows became in some writings almost literal. Later humanists, reflecting on the plague centuries after, described knowledge itself as something haunted. Haunted by the losses of the past, haunted by the countless works that had perished. They compared the survivors of the plague to fragments of manuscripts, incomplete, torn, missing context. And just as the scholar must piece together meaning from a damaged codex, so too must humanity piece together meaning from the shattered remnants of its own history. But there is another, more intimate dimension to this imagery. Imagine a child in plague years, slipping into a monastery library, not as a scholar, but as a wanderer. The shelves rise high above, filled with books he cannot read. The smell of vellum and dust hangs heavy. The lamps are cold. The benches are empty. He feels that someone should be there, yet no one is. The shadows stretch long, the silence pressing. That memory, whether real or imagined, could haunt a lifetime, turning the library into a place not of learning but of absence. And in truth, many who lived through the plague came to see books differently. Knowledge, once pursued with joy and ambition, now seemed fragile, even dangerous. Some believed that too much study weakened the body, making one vulnerable to illness. Others thought that reading about the plague could summon it, as though the words themselves carried infection. Superstition clung to the page. In Venice, one account describes books being sprinkled with vinegar before being read, as though ink might harbor contagion. It is a striking image of a scholar opening a damp, sour-smelling manuscript, the letters swimming as the page curls, while outside the city tolls with plague bells. The library of shadows is not merely metaphor. It was a lived experience. It was the sight of empty benches, the feel of abandoned pages, the smell of mildew and vinegar, the hush of dust settling where voices once debated. It was the sensation of being watched, not by the living, but by the absence of the living. And it is a sensation that still echoes in the manuscripts that survive. To trace the half-formed letter of a dead scribe, to run a finger along the margin where someone once whispered a desperate prayer, that is to touch a shadow across centuries. The chapter closes here, not with a feast or a graveyard, but with shelves. With the silence of books unread, with manuscripts broken off mid-sentence, with prayers squeezed into margins. The plague devoured bodies, yes. But it also devoured words, thoughts, and memories. And the libraries of Europe still carry those absences, those shadows, waiting in the quiet for anyone who dares to read between the lines. You find yourself once again wandering into the dim glow of torchlight, the air thick with incense, and the faint musk of hay from somewhere nearby. We are in the last corner of this medieval carnival of fears, obsessions, and awkward rituals. By now you've walked with me through fumigated wedding nights, sermons that could make you swear off fun forever, charms tied with knots and beads, exorcisms that made lovemaking a cosmic war zone, and even saints who had more to say about bedsheets than charity. Yet somehow, we have not yet reached the true, quiet absurdity that tied all of this together, the belief that sex itself was both the source of all power and the seed of all ruin. That's what this is about. Not the rituals themselves, not the charms, not the bones or the candles or the wandering priests. It's about the atmosphere of suspicion, the paranoia woven so tightly into the everyday fabric of medieval life that a single glance could mean damnation. It's about the silent weight that every man and woman carried in their marriages and their private hours, knowing that in the eyes of God, their neighbors, and often the law itself, no act of love was truly free. We're standing now in a cramped wooden hut on the edge of a town, sometime around the year 1385. The shutters rattle in the wind. Inside, a young couple whispers beneath their blankets, not unlike countless others before them. Only here's the difference. They're not whispering sweet nothings. They're whispering about the calendar. Yes, the calendar. Because tonight is Saturday, and Sunday morning looms. Everyone knows that the act of creation, if performed within 12 hours of Mass, is a sin grave enough to drag your soul toward hell. Imagine that pressure. You're finally in the mood, and suddenly you realize it's against the rules. Like realizing halfway through a Netflix binge that your trial expired last week, and you're now racking up fees with every episode. It wasn't just Sundays. The medieval church, with its love for structure, ruled that no relations should occur on feast days, during Lent, during Advent, on Fridays, before communion, during the woman's monthly cycle, or any time one partner had fasted. Do the math, and you'll discover that out of 365 days, married couples were left with maybe 100 safe days at best. Which might explain why medieval families were still surprisingly large. Either people were terrible at calendars, or they were excellent at quietly ignoring priests. Now imagine the absurdity of lying awake at night calculating. No, dear, not tonight. It's the eve of St. Bartholomew. Best wait until next Thursday. It would be funny if it weren't so deeply suffocating. And yet, within those walls, behind closed shutters, people still reached for each other. Because rules or no rules, sermons or no sermons, the desire to connect was far stronger than fear. Which might be the most human part of the entire medieval story. But rules had a way of leaking into the bedroom regardless. Husbands feared their wives were too lustful. Wives feared their husbands would tire of them and claim divine cause for annulment. Communities whispered about couples who conceived children on forbidden days, children thought to be cursed or marked. One of the cruelest beliefs was that malformed babies were punishments for their parents' sins in bed. Imagine being a grieving mother, your newborn frail and struggling, and someone whispering that you caused it by lying with your husband on a Friday. It's cruelty wrapped in piety, and it happened often enough to leave scars on generations. And yet, there's always that spark of rebellion. Even in the darkest corners of rules and punishments, medieval people joked, teased, and lived. Marginal doodles in manuscripts show monks sketching couples locked in playful embraces while a disapproving bishop looks on. Popular songs survive with verses so bawdy they'd make your grandmother faint. And the local taverns. Well, let's just say half the gossip traded overall wasn't about farming. Behind the stern mask of superstition, laughter was always peeking through. Because humanity cannot live on fear alone. Picture it with me now. You, standing in that tavern, the smell of roasted meat heavy in the air, the floor sticky with spilled drink. A bard strums a lute, singing not of saints or crusades, but of lovers sneaking past watchful in-laws. of charms hidden under pillows, of women who pretended to follow the church's calendar, but winked at their husbands when the door closed. The crowd roars with laughter, and for a moment the walls of superstition crack. Humor was their rebellion. Jokes were their shield. If you couldn't change the system, you could at least laugh in its face. By now, you've walked so far with me through this maze of taboos that you can almost smell the parchment ink of the laws, the sweat of the anxious groom, the tang of herbs burning in a pan by the bed. But step back with me now. Look at the larger picture. Why did these bizarre sexual superstitions thrive for centuries? Why did people cling to onions, relics, knots, calendars, sermons, and whispers in the dark? The answer, when you strip away the absurdity, is simple control. Sex is power, and power always attracts rules, whether from religion, politics, or just sheer human insecurity. Controlling intimacy has always been the easiest way to control people. The Middle Ages may seem far away, but are we so different now? Think of the endless flood of modern rules about what is right or wrong in relationships, dating etiquette, health fads, influencers promising better performance through supplements. We may no longer believe sparrow brains will save us, but we still buy powders and pills that promise the same magic. We may not think demons tie our knots, but we still whisper about shame and failure in hushed tones. Strip away the costumes, and medieval superstition isn't gone. It just wears new clothes. As you and I step into the quiet outside the tavern, the night cool on our skin, the town dark but alive with distant dogs barking, think about the arc we've traveled. 10 bizarre superstitions, each more tangled than the last, each revealing not just the oddity of the past, but the echo of our present. From the first awkward fumigated wedding nights to this final laughter in the tavern, the story has always been the same: fear, hope, control, rebellion, and the stubborn refusal of people to stop reaching for one another, no matter how many rules are hung above their beds. And so here we end, at the threshold of dawn, standing between torchlight and sunrise. If history has a final whisper here, it is this: people will always try to wrap the most natural things in chains of superstition, but people will also always find ways to laugh, to love, and to break those chains, which, if you think about it, makes our story less about bizarre rules and more about resilience. Now the torches sputter, the town falls to silence, and we leave our medieval travelers behind, still fumbling, still praying, still joking, still loving. The echo of their laughter follows us out, and maybe, just maybe, it sounds a little like our own. And so our journey drifts to its close. The candles of the past burn low, the voices of monks, lovers, and whispering townsfolk fading into the quiet of history. What remains is only the echo, the reminder that even in the strangest of times, people longed for comfort, connection, and laughter in the dark. If your eyes grow heavy now, let them close. If you are already half dreaming, let these tales dissolve into softer shapes, until they are nothing but mist. Tomorrow new stories will wait for us, stranger rituals, forgotten lives, and hidden truths. But for now all is still, and all is safe. Good night, traveler. Sleep deeply. The past will keep until morning.